Good morning and welcome. This is a formal Senate hearing, so in order to allow the committee to conduct its business, I'm going to maintain decorum. That means if there is any disorder or demonstration by a member of the audience, the person causing the disruption will be escorted from the room by the Capitol Police. With that said, I call this hearing to order. Today we're going to consider the nomination of Andrew Wheeler to be Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. Before I speak about Acting Administrator Wheeler's nomination, I want to take a moment to welcome the new members of our committee, Senators Braun and Senators Kramer. Welcome to the committee. I know that your experience and expertise will strengthen our committee and bring fresh perspectives to our debates. So, welcome. I'd also like to welcome back all of the old members of the committee. I look forward to working with each of you as we conduct the committee's business this Congress, which brings us to the business of today's hearing. President Trump has nominated Environmental Protection Agency Acting Administrator Andrew Wheeler to serve as the administrator of the agency. Mr. Wheeler has served as Deputy Administrator of the EPA since April of 2018, when the Senate confirmed his nomination with bipartisan support. Since July of last year, Mr. Wheeler has served as the Acting Administrator of EPA. I believe Acting Administrator Wheeler has done an outstanding job leading the EPA these past 6 months. Under Acting Administrator Wheeler's leadership, the agency has taken a number of significant actions to protect our nation's environment while also supporting economic growth. Acting Administrator Wheeler has led efforts to issue common-sense regulatory proposals, like the Affordable Clean Energy Rule and the revised definition of waters of the United States. Implement the committee's 2016 bipartisan reform of the Toxic Substances Control Act in an effective and efficient manner. He's reduced lead exposure, including through the Federal Lead Action Plan, provided greater regulatory certainty to states, to tribes, to localities, and the regulated community, and has improved enforcement and compliance assistance. Acting Administrator Wheeler is very well qualified to run the Environmental Protection Agency. Before his leadership roles at the agency, Mr. Wheeler spent 25 years working in the environmental field as a career employee with the Environmental Protection Agency, as this committee's Clean Air Subcommittee Staff Director, as then the full committee Staff Director and Chief Counsel, and finally as a consultant for a large variety of energy and environmental clients. Mr. Wheeler has received broad and bipartisan support. Former Democrat vice presidential candidate and U.S. Senator Joe Lieberman, who served as a member of this committee while Mr. Wheeler was staff director, stated when Wheeler was nominated for deputy director that, quote, Mr. Wheeler conducted himself in a fair and professional manner, and I hope his nomination will receive similarly fair consideration by the Senate. Ranking Member Carper said of Mr. Wheeler at one point, he said, I think having worked in the agency, he actually cares about the environment, the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the planet in which we live. The EPA Administrator plays a central role in developing and implementing programs and activities focused on fulfilling the EPA's mission of protecting human health and the environment. We know how well qualified Mr. Wheeler is, and when confirmed, what a wealth of experience and expertise he's going to bring to this critically important job. I'm going to work with committee members to move this important nomination forward. I'd now like to turn to the ranking member for his statement.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and to Mr. Wheeler, welcome. It's good to see you. Thanks for meeting with my staff and me yesterday and in past occasions as well. Just 1 week ago, President Trump nominated you to be the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, the agency you already lead as its acting administrator. If I'm not mistaken, under the Federal Vacancies Act, you can continue to serve as both the EPA acting administrator and the president's nominee for 203 more days. And with many EPA staff members furloughed today on the 26th day of President Trump's government shutdown, a number of Democratic members of this committee are concerned that we're rushing to move forward with your confirmation process. I realize we don't all agree on this, but my view is that EPA is shut down largely because their president wants Congress to approve an additional $6.5 billion in funding now for a 2,000-mile wall along our southern border that with Mexico, that the Mexicans were supposed to pay for. Meanwhile, because of the continuing shutdown across our country, our environment and public health are increasingly in jeopardy. With much of EPA shutdown, rules are not being written. Drinking water and power plant inspections are not being performed. Superfund sites are not being cleaned up. The safety of new chemicals is not being assessed. Public meetings are being canceled. And just as important, some 14,000 furloughed EPA employees are unsure if they'll be able to afford their mortgages, daycare providers, or grocery and electricity bills. And some of those furloughed employees appear to have been asked to help prepare for this very hearing. Yet, despite that, this committee is moving quickly to process your nomination. I don't believe that giving the acting administrators a speedy promotion is more urgent and more important than protecting the public from contamination to our air and water and lands. Our priority should be reopening our government, certainly reopening EPA and the other closed federal agencies. The day after Mr. Wheeler was named EPA acting administrator last summer, I sent him a letter. And in that letter, I reminded Mr. Wheeler of the challenge and the opportunity he was granted to chart a new course for the agency after the scandal-plagued tenure of Scott Pruitt. Mr. Wheeler is certainly not the ethically bereft embarrassment that Scott Pruitt proved to be. And to be fair, he is engaged more frequently and substantively than Scott Pruitt with both Congress and the EPA career staff. I knew that Mr. Wheeler and I would not agree on every issue. We don't. But I hope that he would moderate, I had hoped that he would moderate some of Scott Pruitt's most environmentally destructive policies, specifically where the industry and the environmental community are in agreement. Regrettably, my hopes have not been realized. In fact, upon examination, Mr. Wheeler's environmental policies appear to be almost as extreme as his predecessors, despite the promise that Mr. Wheeler made when he first appeared before our committee. For example, Mr. Wheeler said repeatedly that he agreed with the goal that many of us share, striking a deal between automakers and the state of California on fuel economy and greenhouse gas tailpipe standards. The entire auto industry, I've just come from the auto show in Detroit on Monday, but the entire auto industry, many members of Congress and other stakeholders have asked repeatedly for a compromise that would provide certainty and predictability for the industry. However, instead of making a serious effort, a vigorous effort to find the win-win outcome that he envisioned, Mr. Wheeler signed off on a proposal that preempts California, freezes standards for the better part of a decade. I've heard that the Trump administration now plans to finalize a 0.5% annual increase in the stringency of the standards, a rate that is 10 times weaker than the current rules. This will only lead to extensive litigation and uncertainty for automakers, and that's not a win-win outcome. It's really more of a lose-lose. Here's another example of Mr. Wheeler's forgotten promises. And Mr. Wheeler recently signed a proposal to remove the legal underpinnings of the mercury and air toxics standards. EPA decided it's no longer, quote, appropriate and necessary, close quote, to protect the brains of infants from mercury and air toxic pollution emitted by electric utilities. Using outdated data and deeming that some benefits like reductions in cancer, birth defects, and asthma attacks are no longer important to consider, EPA is setting a dangerous precedent and putting the MATS rule in legal jeopardy. EPA has gone so far as to request public comment on whether the standards should be eliminated. Mr. Wheeler says that this action is necessary and that the proposal strikes a balance. I just don't think that's true. No court has ordered this action. No utilities are asking for this action, and the proposal is not needed to protect public health. In fact, the utility industry is in full compliance with these standards, full compliance, at 1/3 the expected cost. Think about that, 1/3 of the expected cost. Every stakeholder from coal-fired utilities to religious leaders to environmental organizations to the Chamber of Commerce urge this administration not to take this step. Surprisingly, Mr. Wheeler has chosen to ignore the course of stakeholders who all hope that he and the EPA would, and this administration would chart a more responsible path. A final example of Mr. Wheeler's failure to lead lies in the agency's reported opposition to submitting to the Senate for ratification the Kigali treatment to phase out harmful refrigerants. Safer substitutes are made in Texas and Louisiana with American technology by American companies whose investments and jobs are at risk when China dumps cheaper, polluting products onto the market. Ratification of this treaty is supported by a truly staggering list of stockholders that range from the American Chemistry Council to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to FreedomWorks, the Sierra Club. Almost everyone, it seems, except EPA. Mr. Wheeler, when you work with us in the Senate, you're able to identify areas where compromise was possible. It remains my hope that you can reverse course and commit to seize upon the policy win-wins like these and others that protect our environment and our environment while protecting and providing industry with the certainty that they need and deserve. That is what the American people expect and deserve from anyone who's been nominated to lead the Environmental Protection Agency. And based on what we've seen so far, without such commitments, that is not the nominee that we have before us today. I say that with no joy. I say that with no joy. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Carper. Senator Inhofe, would you like to introduce Mr. Wheeler?
I would like to introduce Mr. Wheeler, and I'm honored that he invited me to do that. And I'm very excited about the prospects of taking his temporary job into a permanent job. It may come as a shock to some of you that I don't totally disagree with my good friend, Senator Carper. I really think that the midst of the Schumer shutdown is a good time to confirm some of these very important nominees. And there's not one that is more important or a position that's more important than we have right now. Back when President Trump nominated Andrew as deputy administrator, I said that there was no one more qualified. And now that he's been acting administrator for the past 6 months, Andrew's ability to lead the agency has never been clearer. After earning a law degree at Washington University in St. Louis School of Law, Andrew joined the EPA as a special assistant to the agency's pollution prevention and toxics office in 1991. It's been a lot of years, a lot of experience. He was an EPA employee for 4 years, transitioning to the George H.W. Bush administration, then to the Clinton administration, and earning 3 bronze medals for commendable service along the way. For those of you who don't know, the bronze medal is given for, and this is a quote, significant service or achievements in support of the agency's mission or for demonstration of outstanding accomplishments in supervision and leadership. When Andrew left the agency, he brought that sense of service and leadership with him to the United States Senate, where I had a front row seat to his high quality of character and witnessed the dedication he brings to every job and issue. Andrew started in my personal office as chief counsel, transitioned to staff director for the U.S. Senate subcommittee, the subcommittee on clean air, and climate change, wetlands, and nuclear safety. I was the chairman of that subcommittee at that time. In 2003, when I became chairman of this committee, Andrew became the chief counsel. Over the next 6 years, he would eventually become staff director, and we worked closely together on highway bills, energy bills, Diesel Emissions Reduction Act, the Clear Skies Act, and many other pieces of legislation. Since leaving the U.S. Senate in 2009, Andy has continued to build on his reputation as a leader in energy and environmental policy and brought this vast wealth of knowledge and expertise on environmental issues to the EPA. The Senate confirmed him as deputy administrator in April of last year on a bipartisan basis, and he became acting administrator in early July. I was lucky enough to attend his welcome speech to the employees of the agency and saw a man who respected the agency and the work that the agencies and that the career staffers do. This is something that's unusual. I don't think that Andrew knew that I was there in the audience, but there, I don't know how many, Andrew, a couple of 300 people from that administration, from that, the EPA, all of them there with the highest possible respect for Andrew Wheeler. He's worked on the issues in his entire 28-year career. I'm honored that he chose to spend half of that time with me, and I believe that the U.S. Senate benefited from his leadership, and I know America will as well. So I remember looking at the expressions on the faces of the individuals out there thinking, you know, there's room at the top for me too. There are several hundred people in there who had had a career, such as Andrew had, starting at the bottom, and here is the top. So he's done a great job. I'm just very excited to be looking forward to working with him in a new capacity that I haven't experienced before. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Inhofe. And now I'd like to welcome our nominee to the committee, Andrew Wheeler, nominee to be Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. I want to remind you that your full written testimony will be made a part of the record, so we all look forward to hearing your testimony. I would invite you to introduce or reintroduce to the committee your family, and then please proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Senator. Joining me today is my nephew, Luke Cooper, and he brought along his parents with him, my sister Liesl and her husband, Tim. And I also have two friends that I met my first day in law school back in 1987, Judy Kim and Dawn Sidney. Dawn was at my confirmation hearing for the deputy administrator, and today she brought her mother with her, Betty Beveridge, who traveled here from Florida to be here today. So I want to thank all of them for coming today. Thank you.
Thank you and welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Carper, and members of the committee. And thank you, Senator Inhofe, for the introduction. I'm honored and grateful that President Trump has nominated me for the position of Administrator.
Please restore order. The officers, please restore order in the committee room.
This man wants to deregulate. This is an outrage. Shut down Wheeler. Nothing is.
Please restore order in the committee room. Please proceed.
Thank you, Senator. I'm honored and grateful that President Trump has nominated me for the position of Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. There is no more important responsibility than protecting human health and the environment. It is a responsibility I take very seriously. Since becoming the acting administrator, I have focused our efforts on providing greater certainty to the American public, certainty in our EPA programs, certainty to the states, tribes, and local governments, and certainty on how we communicate risk. Personally, I've also worked to provide more certainty to Congress. Immediately after becoming the acting administrator, I reached out to the chairs and ranking members of our authorizing and appropriating committees in both the House and the Senate. I have met in person or by phone with many of you on specific issues of concern, and I will always make myself available. The American public has a right to know the truth about the risks they face in their daily lives and how we are responding. It is our responsibility to explain it to them clearly and consistently. This includes recognizing the progress we have made as a nation and where more progress still needs to be made. From 1970 to 2017, U.S. criteria air pollution fell by 73%, while the economy grew over 260%, and we are ranked #1 in the world for access to safe drinking water. In addition, in 2018, we finalized 13 major deregulatory actions, saving Americans roughly $1.8 billion in regulatory costs. Yet there are Americans who have not shared in this progress. It is these Americans that President Trump and his administration are focused on.
Could the nominee suspend for a second? I ask the officers to please keep the doors closed so that the nominee will not be disrupted additionally. Thank you.
It is these Americans that President Trump and his administration are focused on. Americans without access to safe drinking water, or Americans living on or near hazardous sites, often unaware of the health risks that they and their families face. Many of these sites have languished for years, even decades. How can these Americans prosper if they cannot live, learn, or work in healthy environments? The answer is simple: they cannot. President Trump understands this, and that is why he is focused on putting Americans first. The Superfund program is a perfect example. In fiscal year 2018, EPA deleted all or part of 22 sites from the National Priorities List, the largest number of deletions in 1 year since fiscal year 2005. And we are in the process of cleaning up some of the nation's largest, most complex sites and returning them to productive use. This past summer, I visited the Anaconda and Butte sites in Montana, the first visit to both sites by the head of EPA in nearly 20 years. We are finalizing cleanup plans that will return these lands to productive use an action which has literally been stymied for decades. This past September, EPA issued a record of decision requiring removal of the worst contaminated sediment, including mercury and PCBs, at the Berries Creek site in New Jersey. At the U.S. smelter and lead refinery site in East Chicago, we were able to issue a proposed $25 million cleanup plan that will address lead-contaminated soil in Zone 1 of the site. We've also made safe drinking water a priority as well. In May of 2018, we convened the first ever National Leadership Summit to help states address the emerging risks associated with PFAS. We also hosted a series of visits in communities directly impacted by PFAS. Using information from these events and other public input, we will release a PFAS management plan in the very near future. We're also taking important actions to protect our children from the dangers of lead exposure. We proposed stronger dust lead hazard standards, and we are updating the lead and copper rule for the first time in over 2 decades. These actions and more are detailed in the new federal lead action plan announced in December. In addition, we are using our grant and financing programs to help communities replace lead surface lines and upgrade their water infrastructure. Under President Trump, EPA has issued 7 WIFIA loans totaling over $1.5 billion. Combined, these projects will help finance over $3.5 billion in infrastructure investments while creating over 6,000 jobs, and that's just the beginning. This past year, we invited an additional 39 projects across the nation to apply for the WIFIA loans that would help finance $12 billion in infrastructure and create up to 183,000 jobs. On the air side, we have launched common sense reforms, such as the Cleaner Trucks Initiative. By working closely with states and the private sector, we will reduce NOx emissions from heavy-duty trucks, which is not required by statute or court order, but it makes sense to do. Finally, we propose 3 major rulemakings on our new Waters of the U.S. definition, the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, and the Safe Vehicles Rule in conjunction with the Department of Transportation. Through our regulatory reforms, the Trump administration is proving that burdensome federal regulations are not necessary to drive environmental progress. What makes our actions effective and durable is our commitment to vigorously enforce them. In fiscal year 2018, EPA enforcement actions required the treatment, disposal, or elimination of 809 million pounds of pollutants and waste, almost twice as much compared to 2017. We also entered into the largest settlement in the history of the enforcement of the Risk Management Program, with the responsible parties spending $150 million on major safety improvements. I am proud of our accomplishments, and I know that none of it would be possible without our talented and dedicated EPA career staff. Just last week, EPA and the Department of Justice announced a $490 million settlement with Fiat Chrysler for cheating U.S. emission standards. For 3 years, Fiat Chrysler told us that their vehicles were compliant, yet it was EPA engineers in Ann Arbor that caught them cheating. And then they proved how they were cheating, and that was no easy task. Defeat devices are hidden in vehicle software, which contains more than 100 million lines of code. To give you an idea of what the EPA staff had to deal with, an F-22 fighter jet has less than 2 million lines of code, and a Boeing 787 has around 14 million lines. So I am proud and grateful for our talented career staff that were able to detect and expose these defeat devices. This is just one of the many examples of the expertise that our career staff bring to the agency, and is just one of the many reasons that I miss our furloughed employees and look forward to getting them back to work as soon as possible. Thanks to the hardworking public servants, pollution is on the decline. Our focus now is to accelerate its decline, particularly in communities where it poses the most immediate and lasting harm. Thank you for your time. I look forward to answering your questions.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony. The hearing is going to include, as you mentioned, the questions. There'll be 2 5-minute rounds of questions. I'll start the second round after we close the first round, but to be fair to all the members of the committee and to the witness, I ask senators to please limit your questions in each round to 5 minutes. Throughout the hearing and with the questions for the record, our committee members will have an opportunity to learn more about your commitment to public service, to our great nation. And I'd like to ask, though, that throughout the hearing, you please respond to the questions today as well as those submitted for the record. Now, there are a couple of questions I have to ask. I do of all nominees. I did with you previously, and these are on behalf of the committee. Do you agree, if confirmed, to appear before this committee or designated members of the committee and other appropriate committees of the Congress and provide information subject to appropriate and necessary security protection with respect to your responsibilities?
I do.
And do you agree to ensure that testimony, briefings, documents, and electronic and other forms of information are provided to this committee and its staff and other appropriate committees in a timely manner?
I do.
And do you know of any matters which you may or may not have disclosed that might place you in a conflict of interest if you're confirmed?
I do not.
All right, well, I'll now begin my first round of questions, and for the information of senators, we will be having 2 rounds, as I stated previously. So let me just start with this. The EPA, one of the federal agencies directly impacted by the partial government shutdown. Could you explain what actions you have taken to ensure that the EPA continues to fulfill the mission of protecting human health and the environment during this period?
Absolutely, Senator, thank you. And first, again, I want to say I really am looking forward to our furloughed employees coming back to work. We are still on the job on any emergency actions as well as any court-ordered actions. For example, we still have personnel on the ground in California dealing with the wildfires, people in Puerto Rico dealing with for the hurricane, as well as other emergency responses that have been ongoing. Since the shutdown, we've responded to 7 new emergency responses around the country. We continue to monitor our hotline and tips line. And we're also fulfilling all of our court-ordered deadlines. A perfect example, as the shutdown has continued, we are taking a look at what the deadlines are that are coming up. We have 5 or 6 regulations that have court-ordered deadlines. One of them is our lead dust regulation, which is due in June. I sat down with my senior staff last week, and we charted out what are the court-ordered deadlines. Working backwards, when do we have to need people back on the job to take care of those? We recalled people this week to work on the lead dust regulation. Out of 14,000 employees, we started with around 700 that were exempt from the furlough. We're around 800 now, but it varies on a day-to-day basis.
The next question, the Clean Air Act requires the EPA grant relief to small refineries, which suffer disproportionate economic hardship under the Renewable Fuel Standard, the RFS. The law explicitly states that a small refinery may petition the EPA for hardship relief, it says, at any time. Do you agree the EPA doesn't have the authority to limit when small refineries can apply for that hardship relief?
That is correct. They can apply at any point.
And the law further states the EPA needs to act within 90 days upon receiving a petition from a small refinery. Do you agree the EPA doesn't have the authority to delay decisions on small refinery petitions beyond the 90 days?
I agree, but the petition first goes to the Department of Energy for technical review before it comes to the EPA.
According to the EPA's online dashboard, there are at least 11 petitions that have been pending for more than 90 days. Is that correct?
I'm not sure of the number.
Okay, thank you. I never cease to be amazed by the power of innovation. From energy production to manufacturing, the nation has grown and improved the environment significantly. One key question is how we can harness that innovation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and turn these emissions into useful products. I think we have discussed that we can use carbon dioxide to get oil out of the ground, to construct building materials, to make fuels. What role does the EPA play in supporting innovations that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
We have a lot of opportunities, and we do that through our AIR program as well as all of our programs, looking at new innovation and encouraging new innovation. And what I think is important is on our regulatory side is that we don't try to tip the scale one way or the other on, for example, energy sources. We want to encourage innovation in the marketplace and encourage new ideas to come forward.
Thank you. I'm going to reserve the balance of my time. Senator Carper.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record several articles in a letter that describe the current state of affairs at EPA during this government shutdown. While 95% of EPA employees are not receiving paychecks, EPA also is not fully carrying out its fundamental core mission, that is to protect human health and the environment. This means that scientists may lose data collection opportunities related to the deadly California wildfires. There is no EPA supervision at too many of our Superfund sites, and many more critical functions will not proceed until the EPA is funded. That's my report.
Without objection.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about PFOA, PFOS, and the PFAS chemicals that have caused fact that we don't have a federal drinking water standard for those chemicals has caused a number of states, sort of like flying in the face of the TSCA legislation, toxic substance legislation, that we passed a couple of years ago. But then a number of the states have basically taken matters in their own hands. And states that have set their own standards include California, Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, Minnesota, New Hampshire, New Jersey, North Carolina, and Vermont. And my question is this, Mr. Wheeler, your PFAS management plan was supposed to come out, I think, last fall, but it's been delayed. And I'm asking you to commit to the members of this committee that EPA will set a drinking water standard for these chemicals within 2 years. And can you make that commitment today?
I can't, well, first of all, our PFAS management plan, we were hoping to unveil it next week. With the shutdown, it's going to be delayed slightly. It's in the middle of interagency review. We are looking at all of our statutes, and I'm not going to prejudge any one particular. Because of the interagency review, the other agencies have to sign off on the plan itself. But we are looking at all of our statutes, enforcement abilities. We have been enforcing on drinking water around the country in a number of sites. We're helping states.
I'm asking you if you could commit 2 years. We're not talking 2 months or 2 weeks. I'm asking you to make a commitment to us that EPA will set a drinking water standard for these chemicals within 2 years. Can you make that commitment today? And if you can't, just say, I can't make it today.
I can't make that commitment because it's an interagency review at this point. I do want to correct one thing.
I do want to ask, I just want to convey, in part, a sense of urgency on PFAS and, frankly, on the others. I'm going to go. We only have 5 minutes. I have 3 minutes left.
You said 95% of the EPA is not getting paid. Nobody at the EPA is getting paid today.
All right,
but I want to thank Congress for passing the legislation
Thank you very much.
to guarantee the back pay for everyone.
Clean cars. I mentioned I was at the Detroit Auto Show go almost every week. Been going for a long, long time. Met with representatives of 10 automobile companies. They all had one message for me. Well, actually 2 or 3. One message is they want certainty, predictability. They're building more energy-efficient cars. Their future is electric-powered vehicles. Their future is hydrogen-powered vehicles. They need charging stations to be deployed, built across the country. They need fueling stations to be built. They need a tax credit extended for electric vehicles. They don't want to end up in a lawsuit with California and 12, 13 other states for the next 4 or 5 years. They need certainty, predictability. They want some near-term flexibility on the fuel efficiency standards and tailpipe emissions that were set in the last administration. They want some flexibility in the near term and then more rigor on the standards in the long term. And why is EPA, why is California, these other 13 states, why are we unable to come to agreement on a deal that every auto company wants?
Senator, and we talked about this yesterday, and I've talked about this with you at least 4 or 5 times. I know the time, I'm not going to go through the entire back and forth that we've had with the state of California, but nobody wants a 50-state deal more than I do. I think that is the success of a program if we have a 50-state deal. I haven't given up hope on that yet, but we're also looking at the calendar, and we know that we need to get we need to finalize our proposal by March 30th. We're running short of time, but I've met with Mary Nichols from California 3 times in my office. We've had numerous conversations. My staff has worked with her staff for months now. We would love to have a 50-state solution.
Greatest source of carbon emissions on our planet right now is mobile sources, our cars, trucks, and vans. Now, there is a deal that's ready to be made, I would just urge you I'm trying to impart some sense of urgency. If I were you, I would have her in my office. I would be in California. I would be trying to make this deal. And this idea that we're waiting for them or they're waiting for us, that's not, your job is to basically be the leader for fighting this battle. We've seen, I think, oceans, I'm told, are heating up by 40% faster on average than predicted by global science community just 5 years ago. This year that we're just finished is the hottest year on effort. I would just urge you to feel some sense of urgency on this stuff, okay? Let's talk about mercury. I'll reserve the balance of my time, and then we'll get into mercury. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Cromer. Senator Inhofe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's a lot of media spin, and you heard it again just now, over the recent report showing that CO2 emissions in the United States increased last year. A lot of the adversaries are wanting to blame the administration's so-called rollback of the Clean Power Plan and withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, among other actions. I'd like to enter into the record this Forbes article that says this isn't surprising given the unprecedented economic growth that the United States has seen in the last year, and states, quote, CO2 emissions in the United States are still down 11% since 2005. Can you address this mischaracterization?
Without objection.
Yes, Senator, you're correct. Our CO2 emissions peaked in 2005. It's been on a decline since then. We believe, and I was just briefed by my career staff yesterday morning on this, that we're going to continue to see a decline in CO2 emissions. But last year, we had an exceptionally hot summer and cold winter, but we had, and more importantly, an uptick in manufacturing and industrial output that brought our CO2 emissions up slightly. But overall, we don't expect that to continue. We think the downward trend is going to continue in the long term.
That economic growth has been phenomenal. And so I assume that the ACE rule would continue a general downward trend in CO2.
It will. After ACE is fully implemented, we expect CO2 levels to decrease an additional 34% by 2005 levels from the electric power sector.
Of all the regulations from the previous administration in my state of Oklahoma, the one that was that the farmers of America, not just in my state of Oklahoma, but throughout the country, found the WOTUS rule to be the one that was the scariest of all of them. And it's one that you have reworked, and I've heard nothing but praise about this, and I'd like to have you share with us the successes that you've had in that particular rule. That's the one rule that means the most to my Oklahoma farmers.
Thank you, Senator. We put out our proposal in December, and the overarching guiding principle that I gave the staff in crafting the WOTUS rule was that I believe that any property owner should be able to stand on his or her property and be able to tell for themselves whether or not they have waters of the U.S. on their property without having to hire an outside consultant or an attorney. And I say that knowing that I used to be an outside consultant, putting some people out of business. But I think people should be able to tell for themselves whether or not they have a wetland on their property. And I want to make a big distinction that is usually not discussed, particularly in the media, that we're working in partnership with the states. And even if a water is not a water of the United States, it doesn't mean that it's not protected at the state level. A lot of waters and a lot of the wetlands that would no longer be considered a federal waterway under the new WOTUS proposal will still be protected under state laws, and it does not impact our recovery efforts with our national priority areas such as the Chesapeake Bay, the Great Lakes, the Everglades, the Gulf Coast, Puget Sound. All of those recovery efforts will continue, and this does not impact any of those.
Well, I appreciate that. And I'll share with you, the other day I was in western Oklahoma, out in our panhandle, a very arid area, and their concern was if we hadn't done this, we'd probably be considered a wetland now, but well, I'll leave that. I don't have to tell you the position that, my position on RFS, but in light of the rumors about the possible actions that the administration is considering, I'd like to take a moment to remind everyone that corn is not only the only stakeholder in this program. You have the real world costs borne by not just refiners, but also by consumers, by motorcyclists, boat operators, lawn equipment, and for the use of gas blended with ethanol. There is growing concern that the administration is only listening to one side of the argument, and that those arguments are not based on actual real-world conditions. Will any reset rule be based on market realities, including the increased demand for E0 that the market is seeing today?
We will. Thank you, Senator. We will take all of those issues in consideration as part of the reset. We intend to move forward with the reset as well as the E15. The President's committed to the E15. And for the last 2 years, we've gotten the RVOs, which is setting the levels for the renewable fuels for the next year. We've gotten both those out on time, first time that's ever happened in the history of the program, and we're committed to doing that again this year. I think providing the certainty to the marketplace is very important, not just for the farmers, but also for the oil industry as well.
Certainty is very, very important, and you're doing a great job. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Cardin is next, but I think Senator Carper, you have a...
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I have a unanimous consent request to submit for the record the recently released National Climate Assessment by 13 federal agencies under this administration, including EPA. lay out the costs our country will pay if we do nothing on climate change, and you keep rolling back rules. Thank you.
Without objection, Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wheeler, thank you for being here. Thank you for your willingness to serve the public. I just really want to first underscore the point that Senator Carper has made in regards to this shutdown. The shutdown is dangerous, it's devastating to the individuals who are involved, to their families, to paying their bills, but to the missions that these agencies have to carry out. In EPA, you have a very large percentage of your workforce that is furloughed today without pay. So to me, it's not possible under these circumstances for EPA to carry out their mission to protect our environment, clean air and clean water. And you and I had a chance to talk about this in my office, but as you reach certain required deadlines, you need to have the personnel in place. And it's going to be challenging to have workers work without pay, but I just want to underscore how tragic this shutdown is and support Senator Carper in that regard. You talked about partnership with the states, and there's been no, I think, better example of that than the Chesapeake Bay program. We've also had a chance to talk about this. The Chesapeake Bay program was developed by the states in partnership with the stakeholders, developers, local government, farmers, the private groups, and it was based upon what every state can do based upon best science in collaboration in order to improve the quality of the bay. The Washington Post over the weekend published the importance of the Chesapeake Bay health cannot be overstated, and I agree with them completely. It is, the federal role is critically important because that's the umpire. That's the one that holds it together, using TMDLs to establish how we are making progress in every state doing what it says it can do and should do. So my first question to you is, will you support the Chesapeake Bay program in working collaboratively with the other federal agencies, state and local jurisdictions, and stakeholders in protecting the Chesapeake Bay watershed, including through the partners of the program in the office today in Annapolis? I want to point out that this committee has reauthorized the Chesapeake Bay program, recommended that, and the Congress has fully funded the Chesapeake Bay office.
Yes, Senator, I fully commit to that. As you may remember, I live in a Chesapeake Resource Protection area in Virginia. I'm very concerned about the Chesapeake Bay personally. My second week as a deputy administrator, I attended a Chesapeake meeting in D.C., and then the first month as acting administrator, I attended the large meeting in Baltimore with the governors of all the Chesapeake state. So I think we had one lieutenant governor there, but I'm very much committed to the Chesapeake Bay and to the Chesapeake Bay program.
And for the federal office to be located in Annapolis?
Yes.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I want to talk about some of the related issues with clean air. Senator Carper mentioned the mercury standards. So let me start with that. And I, by the way, support Senator Carper in regards to the CAFE or the auto emission standards. That's a huge issue in regards to clean air concerning the Bay. And you mentioned the reduction of CO carbon emissions, but remember that the auto industry is still one of the largest sources. So the CAFE standards are important. But in regards to mercury, I quite frankly don't understand EPA's position. It seems to me that the mercury standards have worked. And in your recent announcements, will there be any reduction in enforcement of the current mercury toxic standards?
We don't believe there will be. We believe that every piece of mercury control equipment that is installed on a power plant today will remain under our proposal. The important thing to remember on the mercury regulation that it's already been fully implemented. But what we had was a Supreme Court case, the Michigan versus EPA case, that directed us to go back and take a look at the cost-benefit analysis that the Obama administration conducted for their original MATS regulation. And we did that. And at the same time, we also conducted the risk and technology review. And by conducting both of those at the same time, under also a D.C. Circuit Court decision, we believe that although we don't find it appropriate and necessary, that under the risk and technology review, that the technologies that have already been implemented on the coal-fired power plants will remain in place. And that is our preferred option under the proposal. We are taking comment. We issued this right before the shutdown began. I don't believe it's been published in the Federal Register yet because the Federal Register is closed. As soon as it does, we're accepting comment on that, and we'd like to have comment, but at the end of the day, I do not believe that a single piece of mercury control technology will be removed from any power plant.
And let me just ask you,
under our preferred option.
let me just ask you lastly, under Section 4101 of the bipartisan WRDA bill, there is EPA is to establish a stormwater infrastructure funding task force composed of representatives of federal, state, and local governments and nonprofit entities to study ways to improve the availability of public and private sources for funding of construction, rehab, and operation, and maintaining our stormwater infrastructure, which is critical to the Bay. Are you committed to setting up that task force?
Yes, we've already started looking at how we can set that up. We believe it'll have to be done under FACA, the FACA process, but we are committed to getting that done.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Before turning to Senator Capito, Senator Inhofe, you have something you want to introduce for the record.
Mr. Chairman, I want to submit 3 things into the record. One is these are items into the record that highlight the flaw in the science and assumptions that make up the 4th National Climate Assessment release. One by the Cato Institute, one by the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and the last one, an article by Nicholas Loris entitled, "The Latest Climate Report Feeds into Alarmist Fearmongering."
Without objection, Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Wheeler, for your willingness to serve. And I know that you have been a great acting administrator at the EPA and would certainly fill that role in a permanent capacity. I would like to say, Senator Cardin's, I echo his concerns, being a state that's impacted by the Chesapeake Bay watershed. West Virginia obviously has impacts there. And I am fully supportive of any work that is being done that benefits not just Maryland, but the whole region as well, and Virginia, as we talked about. I'd also like to just make a comment about the shutdown. I'm speaking for myself. I think that a government in shutdown, I've said, is a useless process, and it's painful for your agency and others that are impacted, and for the American people. But it's fully within the realm of both of our Republican and Democrat colleagues to come to a reasonable conclusion here, and I implore the other side to come to the table. I would like to ask you about some of the criticisms that have been lodged against you, and to give you a chance to respond. Some of our colleagues have talked about the responsiveness of the EPA to congressional letters and inquiries. If you could just flesh that out a little bit. And then yesterday there was a letter that was published that talked about your negligence in recusing yourself from certain matters. I'd just like to give you a chance to address those issues.
Thank you very much.
If you could do it briefly, that'd be great.
Sure. I believe that we have been very responsive to the letters from Congress as well as our FOIA. I would say under FOIA, the Administrator's Office in particular, we've received a 400% increase in FOIA requests during this administration. So we've added on a lot of additional employees to process things like that. On the recusal side, I have worked with the career ethics officials at the agency since day one. I have recused myself from any work involving my prior law firm and all of my prior clients under both the ethics regulations as well as the Trump ethics pledge, and I have not violated that, and I continue to consult with our ethics officials, the career ethics officials, on a regular basis.
Thank you. On PFAS, you and I have talked about this and the concerns that I have, not just in West Virginia, but really nationally. You mentioned that a management plan is going to be coming out, and it has more than just one agency that's weighing in on that. I kind of couldn't tell from your answer whether you're going to be setting a standard in that management plan or not.
We are going to be recommending and moving forward on a number of different areas under a number of different statutes. We're looking at on the water side as well as the CERCLA Superfund side and the TSCA program as well. This is going to be, when it comes out, our management plan, a multimedia approach to dealing with PFAS, PFOA.
So that's a no?
I can't go into the specifics of what's in the management plan because it's currently in interagency review.
Okay. So TB
we were hoping to release it next week, but with the shutdown, it's going to be delayed slightly.
Oh, okay. Another question I have is on the water management issues. There have been a series of reports in Appalachia that have said that the leakage out of our municipal and our rural systems of water is like in West Virginia, it's 55% is lost at a significant cost to taxpayers and also ratepayers and also to the environment. And for areas that are short on water, which doesn't happen to be ours, but for areas that are short on water, this has got to be a daunting challenge for water systems all around the country. And I was wondering if this is something that you see being addressed, that you could address at EPA. Are there specific programs there under the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund that we might have some possibilities to help these systems get more efficient and be better stewards of the environment through the water systems?
I think there is, and I think you're correct under the State Revolving Loan Fund. I think we can be helpful, and certainly would be more than happy to work with you and your staff on trying to address those issues in West Virginia.
I mean, it's obviously a countrywide issue, and
Yes,
I think a lot of it has to do with the age of the when the systems were built and how they haven't been reconstituted. Also, on the Clean Power Plant replacement, we heard that there was an emissions rise in 2018 that was attributed to a cold winter, hot summer, and also to more economic activity.
Yes.
You said you expect that to go down over time. What gives you the confidence if this economy rolls the way we think it's going to, that will actually
We're continuing to see new investments in more energy efficiency on not only on the electric power sector, but also in the automobiles. We still have the CAFE standards in place to reduce emissions going forward there. And once ACE is fully implemented, we will see 34% reductions in CO2 by the 2005 levels. So we see across the board for all the industries that we're working with, we're also seeing reductions in methane emissions as well, that we believe that the CO2 greenhouse gas emissions will continue to go down.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Capito. Senator Sanders.
Well,
Thank you for being with us, Mr. Wheeler. Mr. Wheeler, President Trump has indicated his belief that climate change is a hoax, perhaps perpetrated by the Chinese. Do you agree?
Well, I believe that climate change is real, and I believe that man has an impact on it. And
the President has said that climate change is a hoax. Do you agree with him?
I've not used the hoax word myself.
I see. Leading scientists around the world, looking at many, many hundreds of reports, have indicated that we have 12 years in order to stop the worst impacts of climate change. And what they are talking about are rising sea levels, more drought, more extreme weather disturbances, more wildfires, more migrations of people. Do you agree with the scientific community that climate change is a global crisis that must be addressed in an aggressive way?
I believe that climate change is a global issue that must be addressed globally. No one country can...
That wasn't my question, sir. I don't have a lot of time, and I'd appreciate if you're answering the questions. Scientific community has said that climate change is one of the great crises facing our planet. And if there is not unprecedented action to transform our energy system away from fossil fuel to sustainable energy and energy efficiency, there will be irreparable damage in the United States and in virtually every country on Earth. Do you agree with the scientific community?
I would not call it the greatest crisis, no, sir. I consider it a huge issue that has to be addressed globally.
Well, what you are, I found it interesting, Mr. Wheeler. You are the nominee to be head of the Environmental Protection Agency. You just, in your opening statement, did not mention the word climate change. Now, how does it happen that the nominee to be head of the Environmental Protection Agency does not mention the words climate change at a time when the scientific community thinks that climate change is the great environmental crisis facing this planet? Should the American people have confidence that you're going to help us deal with this global crisis?
Yes, they should have confidence because we are moving forward to reduce CO2. Our ACE proposal will reduce CO2 approximately the same levels that the Clean Power Plan would have if it had been implemented. And we're reducing CO2 from our CAFE standards, and we're also addressing greenhouse gases through our methane program as well.
You're addressing.
Yes.
But the scientific community tells us that we have a crisis and that we need unprecedented action to dramatically reduce carbon emissions, not only in this country, but around the world. Now, we are the strongest economy in the world. And if the leadership of the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States says to China and to Russia and to India, and to countries all over the world that we have got to move aggressively to protect this planet for our children and our grandchildren, we can have some impact on the entire international community. Are you prepared to do that?
We are implementing the laws that Congress has passed.
But you are the leader.
Passes new
We
laws,
need you to come here.
we will implement those.
Well, that's not what I'm talking about. We have people over here who do not believe that climate change is even real. But you are the nominee for the leadership of the Environmental Protection Agency. Will you provide the leadership in this country and the world to say that we are concerned about the future of this planet for our kids and our grandchildren?
We are concerned about the future of this planet for our children and our grandchildren, and we are implementing the laws that have been passed by Congress, including the Clean Air Act, and that's why we're moving forward with the ACE proposal to reduce CO2 from the electric power generating sector. We're moving forward with the Safe Cafe proposal to reduce CO2 levels from—
Mr. Wheeler, is rising sea levels a concern, or is that a hoax?
Rising sea levels is a concern, and we believe in adaptation, and we are looking at a number of things.
I'm sorry, adaptation?
Adaptation to help on rising sea levels, unless absent additional congressional authority.
But you are, here's the point. We have people here who don't believe in climate change, but you are going to be the leader, perhaps, of the environmental protection. We need your assistance now. Is rising sea levels real, and what are we going to do to minimize that? What are we going to do? Are the wildfires that we have seen in California and elsewhere, are those related to climate change in your judgment?
There's probably some relation to climate change. I think the biggest issue with the wildfires has been forest management.
That's the biggest issue,
that is the biggest.
Not the droughts that we are seeing.
That is the biggest issue.
Not the droughts.
In my opinion, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Sanders. We've already heard from Administrator Wheeler that he supports innovation as a means to reduce emissions. I'd recently written a New York Times op-ed entitled "Cut Carbon Through Innovation, Not Regulation." I look forward to working with Acting Administrator Wheeler to support innovation in ways that respect the law and don't unfairly punish businesses. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record New York Times editorial December 18th, 2018, "Cut Carbon Through Innovation, Not Regulation."
Without objection, so long as my response to it can also be put in the record.
It was a very nice letter to the editor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll bring it over here, and we'll have them be a pair.
Great.
By the way, Mr. Chairman, may I place an article in there in response as well?
Yeah, without objection. Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wheeler, I'm going to give you an opportunity to share a little bit in terms of the approaches we need on an international basis, but before we get into that, I'd really like some specific thoughts with regard to an item that you do have control over, and that's the nationwide plan to develop E15 markets. Last week, an EPA spokesman commented on the EPA's proposal to permit the sale of year-round E15, which is 15% ethanol and 85% regular petroleum products. And the quote that was given to us is this: "This is a priority for both President Trump and Acting Administrator Wheeler. The ongoing partial shutdown will not impede the EPA's ability to keep our deadline." I think one of the concerns that a lot of producers in the upper Midwest have with regard to ethanol is that in order to get into the summer driving season, we really need to have the guidelines and rules laid out as quickly as possible. Do you believe that you will be able to commit to finalizing the EPA's rule permitting year-round sale of E15 before the summer driving season starts?
As of today, yes, but I do caveat that with we're unable to work on it right now during the government shutdown.
Where are you in the process, and when do you expect the proposed rule to be released? What's your best guess? And I understand you got a government shutdown you got to work around as well, sir.
I believe we were originally planning on issuing the proposal in February. We've been, I kept the EPA open an additional week, longer than the rest of the federal government. So we haven't been shut down as long as some of the other federal agencies and departments. It's not a day-for-day exchange as far as how much longer it will take us on the proposal, but we may be slightly delayed at this point. But we will get it done before the summer driving season, provided we are back
in a reasonable length of time.
In a reasonable time.
Okay. With regard to within the law, small petroleum refineries are offered the opportunity to request a rollback on their requirement to actually incorporate ethanol into their products. Right now, that's amounted to about a 2.25 billion gallon per year reduction in the total amount of ethanol that's been incorporated into the fuel supplies. I don't think the original intent of Congress was that reduces the total amount of ethanol that is actually being marketed. Can you share with us your thoughts about the options that we've got when we recognize that the law allows those refineries to take a reduction or to apply for a reduction? What guidelines or what alternatives or what authority do you have to try to still meet the original goals for ethanol production, while at the same time honoring the guidelines of the law that allow those smaller refineries a hardship exemption? And can that exemption be reduced if you feel that you cannot meet the guidelines that Congress established with regard to the RVOs?
Well, it's as you know, Senator, we've had 3 court cases on the small refinery program. Instigated during the court cases were instigated during the Obama administration when they were not granting any small refinery exemptions, and EPA has lost all 3 in the courts. So we are moving forward to implement the small refinery exemption. It is included in the Clean Air, well, it's in the RFS program as part of the Energy Policy Act of 2005, Clean Air Act, but it's also been encouraged through the appropriations process. We've gotten appropriations language telling us to implement the small refinery exemption program as well. You're correct. There are 2 competing issues there. Where if you grant a small refinery, it takes barrels away from the overall RFS goal of 15 billion gallons. There's not a lot of leeway for us there. Depends somewhat on the timing of the applications. But if we were to reduce the 15 billion gallons by the amount that we grant, then you'd end up having a rolling impact on having more refineries being subjected to higher levels of the ethanol mandate, and you could end up having even more refineries having to, being eligible for the exemption. What we have tried to do is provide more transparency. We started the dashboard this past fall so that everybody understands what we're doing on the small refinery exemption. And we're also taking a hard look at the overall numbers through our reset program that we intend to move forward, both the reset and the E15 and our RVOs. We're hoping to propose all 3 of those in February.
Very good. Thank you. My time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you very much. Welcome, Mr. Wheeler. I wanted to let you know that I appreciate the polite and professional demeanor that you have brought to your task. Substantively, I continue to believe that you have your thumb, wrist, forearm, and elbow on the scales in virtually every determination that you can in favor of the fossil fuel industry, and I think that is very unfortunate. I do think that there is a baseline that we should work off of straight answers that are truthful and complete. And I would note, with respect to your recent answers to Senator Sanders about the CAFE standards, that the Federal Register analysis, your analysis of the CAFE standard proposal that you have increases CO2 emissions year after year after year after year, up to 9% increased CO2 emissions by 2035 relative to the existing baseline. So I don't think it's fair to say that you're taking action to help the carbon emissions problem when your proposal is worse than the baseline you began with of the Obama CAFE standards. And I'd put the page into the record. It's page 43327. Similarly, you referred to your ACE program replacing the Clean Power Plan as being something that would reduce carbon emissions. And again, your own analysis in the Federal Register, the government's own analysis in the Federal Register, shows that compared to the Clean Power Plan, your proposal will raise carbon emissions, CO2 emissions, by tens of millions of tons every single year, including, for example, in 2030, raising it by 60 million tons in that year. So I'd like to put those two
Without objection
into the record. When you were last here on November 8th, 2017, for your confirmation hearing as deputy, I asked what you knew about your client Bob Murray's so-called action plan that he was running around bragging was being implemented by Scott Pruitt and the Trump administration. Here's what you told me. I did not work on the plan, and I do not have a copy of it. I saw it briefly at the beginning of the year, but I don't have a copy of it. I looked at it and handed it back to Bob Murray. So I think the reasonable conclusion from that testimony is that you really only had a hand on it briefly and only saw it very briefly. Okay. Scroll forward to December 6, 2017, when we learned via published reports that on March 29, 2017, you attended a meeting between your client, Bob Murray, and Energy Secretary Rick Perry, where this action plan was discussed. There you are. And there's the Murray. And if we go on to the next photograph, you can see that this action plan was right there in the room. Boom. And it was a nice, cozy meeting. I'll show the bear hug photo. That's really a sweet regulatory relationship. So,
For the record, that's not me, though.
no. That's your client, Mr. Murray. So we later obtained a copy of the Murray Action Plan, which was in that room with Secretary Perry. It turns out that it was also provided to Vice President Pence, and it was provided to former EPA Administrator Pruitt. Now, you arranged for Murray to meet with Perry, and you tried to schedule a meeting with Pruitt, but he fell ill and the meeting did not take place. Murray was scheduled to meet with Pruitt that same day. Can you tell me now how many meetings with Trump administration officials for Bob Murray did you arrange, attempt to arrange, or attend, and with whom?
Yes, Senator. First of all, I didn't try to arrange the meeting with Scott Pruitt. Somebody else in my firm did that. On the meeting with Secretary Perry, the purpose of that meeting was to talk about the relief, and I forget what it was called at the time.
But my question was actually quite specific, which was how many meetings with Trump administration officials did you arrange or attend for Mr. Murray?
The meeting with Secretary Perry, and then I believe we had an additional meeting at the White House with an energy advisor there, but I did not attempt to arrange or attend any meetings with
Chairman,
Mr. Murray.
I'm sorry, Mr. Wheeler, my time has expired here. What I would like to do, I don't want to play gotcha with you.
Yeah.
What I do want is truthful, complete, factual answers about this. So I'm going to expand on these questions in questions for the record, and I expect you to provide complete and truthful answers as if under oath here at the hearing. Is that understood between us?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Before heading to Senator Bozeman, Senator Inhofe, I think you have a
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's an editorial in Investors Business Daily that was, it looks at the government charts that map out trends in hurricanes, tornadoes, droughts, wildfires, and all that. And there's no upward trend in extreme weather, but instead shows there is no trend in any of them. And I'd ask that this be made a part of the record at this point.
Without objection.
No.
Senator Bozeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here and your willingness to serve. First of all, I want to thank you, you and your staff, for your timely response. We have an issue going on in Bella Vista, Arkansas, with a fire that has to do with a stump disposal. Your staff has been very, very good. This is a state problem, but you do have the expertise on staff to help them.
Senator Bozeman, could I interrupt for just a moment? I dropped the ball here. You had agreed to help out Senator Ernst by allowing her to go first. Would you still like to do that?
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay.
You sure? Okay, I'm sorry. anyway, like I say, thank you for doing that. And I think it's a great example of the agency working with states in situations like that. And, you know, we need more of that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Over the years, were an integral part of helping this committee pass many important pieces of legislation. Few understand the work that goes into getting comprehensive bipartisan legislation passed, which this committee can be very proud of. We've passed a bunch of that. How do you feel your role as a staff member on the EPW committee has prepared you to bring people from all walks of life to the table to develop and implement important EPA regulations?
Thank you, Senator. I think it's helped me a lot. You know, I worked on several highway bills. I was the staff director for the what was it, 05 highway bill that we did, as well as several WRDA bills. We brought together people on both sides. Oftentimes on the highway side, it was people from not necessarily different parties, but different sized states and different parts of the country, and learning about the issues that impact different states, small states, large states, populated states, sparsely populated states. I'm thinking of Alaska and Wyoming in particular. It really does educate somebody on how to address large-scale problems that face the entire country, and that's helped me in my time so far at EPA.
Very good. During the previous administration, there was concern that rules were developed not based on sound science, but on political ideology. Under your leadership, can we expect the EPA to be more transparent regarding how rules are developed? Further, as administrator of the EPA, can we count on you to base all of your decisions on the rule of law and not on the administration's, even your own political ideology?
Absolutely. And I look at, we're following not just the statutes, but also the Supreme Court cases as well. And I know that there are cases where people on the left are not happy that we're moving forward with solutions, and people on the right are not happy we're moving forward with solutions. But it's my job as the EPA administrator to follow the law and follow the Supreme Court cases.
Very good. In your time at EPA and at the EPW committee, you worked hard to improve environmental outcomes while providing regulatory certainty for the country. Can you please explain the environmental and economic benefits regulatory certainty provides? That's what we hear so much, is you can play with good rules, you can play with bad rules. If you don't know what the rules are, it's very, very difficult.
Absolutely, and I think our WOTUS regulation, our proposal for WOTUS, is a perfect example for that. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's really important for a property owner to be able to stand on his or her own property and be able to tell whether or not they have a federal water on their property. And by clearly defining what is and is not, and defining what is not a water of the U.S. is just as important as defining what is, will give that certainty to the American public, and it will allow people to use their property, use their land, and prosper and help the entire country. I think that's very key and important.
Very good. Criticism of EPA during the previous administration was the agency's disconnect with rural America. Many hardworking Americans in rural states felt that they did not have a voice and their opinions did not matter. What have you done and what do you plan to do in the future to facilitate a stronger level of trust between EPA and rural America? You just mentioned the waters of the U.S.
Yes, I've tried to get out of D.C., out of the office as much as I can, travel around the country. I've met with farmers leading up to our WOTUS proposal. I've met with farmers all over the country. I was out in California meeting with farmers, in Kentucky, and Montana, Tennessee. It's really important for me to hear from people as to what their issues are, what their concerns about, and because particularly the farmers in the agriculture community, they're good stewards of the land, and we need to make sure that we're working in conjunction with them to protect the land.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Bozeman.
Mr. Chairman?
Senator Carper.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record an article and letter regarding EPA's dismissal of the particulate matter review panel and the agency's insistence on moving forward with its secret science proposal, limiting scientist input from advisory panels while also attempting to ignore scientific studies where the underlying data has not been made public will greatly hinder EPA's ability to use the best available science to protect human health and the environment. Thank you.
Without objection. Senator Merkley.
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. Yesterday, when we talked, I laid out all the things that are affecting Oregon through climate chaos, affecting our forests, affecting our farming, affecting our fishing. And I asked you, how concerned are you about these impacts on my constituents, the people of the United States? And you shifted to saying, my job is to follow rules and work to obey lawsuits. So I came back to you again, and I said, again, these are tremendous impacts that we're seeing, hugely damaging. How concerned are you? And you shifted to saying you're looking forward to going to Africa to talk about clean drinking water for Africans. I'm going to give you a third chance here to answer this question. The calamities we're seeing are enormous in my state and across this country. More powerful hurricanes, more devastating forest fires, more acidic waters affecting our shellfish industry, loss of water for irrigation from snowpacks, pine beetles that are eating up our forests. So on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being you stay awake night worrying about it, and 1 being it occasionally crosses your mind, how concerned are you about this devastating impact on our nation and the world?
I would say I stay awake at night worrying about a lot of things at the
1 to 10.
agency.
Please answer my question, not answer
8 or
some
9.
other question. 1 to 10 scale, how concerned are you?
8 or 9.
Really? Well, then, let's turn to the issue of ACE, the Affordable Clean Energy Plan. You told me that this gets just as much carbon reduction as does the Clean Power Plan. However, your own agency says that it will result in 3.5% higher CO2 production by 2030 than the Clean Power Plan. Why do you come to my office and tell me it's the same when your agency experts say it will produce a lot more carbon dioxide?
My agency experts have told me that we're going to get a 34% reduction in CO2 based on 2005 levels once the ACE regulation is fully implemented.
Yes, but what you quoted to me was a comparison to the Clean Power Plan. So when you shift statistics, that is not transparency, and that is not integrity. A study from Boston University, Harvard University, Syracuse University found that because ACE has no meaningful reductions in CO2, because it allows plants to bypass pollution controls, that in 20 states you have a significant increase in sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide. You have in 6 states an increase in CO2 as compared to no regulation at all. How does a plan have integrity when you get more reductions from no regulations than from your plan?
Are you referring to this? I believe that study just came out yesterday or today. I saw an article about it this morning. I've not had a chance to review it. I'm not sure how they're calculating that, but that is not what the career people of the agency are telling me about the ACE.
Let's turn to forest fires. It's really shocking to hear you say it's forest management. All the conditions of longer, hotter summers have tremendously increased the fire potential in our forests. We saw it devastating Idaho, Montana, Washington, Oregon, California, under very different types of conditions. Is forest management an issue? Yes, which is why I advocate for thinning and fuels reduction. But that is not the reason these fires are so much longer. It's because the summer season is so much hotter and longer. And we have different types of storms that are starting a lot more fires. So I encourage you to actually become informed on this issue if you're going to comment publicly on it. Would you agree to actually read some of the literature on this?
I will agree to continue to read the literature on this, yes.
When I spoke to you yesterday, I asked if you were aware of how much carbon dioxide rates of production and levels of pollution have increased in your lifetime. And can you now share with me the answer to that question?
I believe you told me it was close to 100% increase in CO2 since I was born.
No, that's not the case, but 100% would be dramatic, but it's not that dramatic. But in your lifetime, or my lifetime, and I'm a few years older than you are, it's about 100 points from about 314 to 414, 100 points, which is more like a 30% increase. So that's a very significant change in the chemistry of our air on this planet. And the other thing I talked to you about was when you were born, or I was born, it was about a rate of a third of a point per year, and now it's about aiming towards 2.5 points per year. In other words, the rate of pollution, despite all the conversation we've been having over the last decade, is accelerating. And this is of enormous concern. that the rate is actually accelerating despite the international conversations. So my time's up. I hope you'll become more familiar with these issues. Our entire ecosystem and our rural agricultural base, which you've been talking about, our fishing, our farming, our forests are at grave risk.
Thank you, Senator Murphy.
I do want to clarify, I meant 100 points, not percent. That was a misstep.
Thank you. Senator Ernst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Wheeler. I do want to commend you because you have been actively engaged with me, with my staff, and I truly do appreciate the time that you have taken to address some of our concerns. What I'd like to just have you reaffirm for me today, and you know exactly the questions I'm going to ask, reaffirm the commitment that we will see E15 for our summer driving season.
Yes, we're still on schedule for that. It depends on, we're not able to work on it during the government shutdown. I also want to, when I listed some of the states that I visited to talk to farmers, I was obviously in Iowa talking to your farmers, and I'm sorry I didn't mention that.
Yes, no, and I do appreciate that because I know the RFS is very important to our Iowa farmers as well as WOTUS. So thank you very much for working on that. We've had a very good response. I do understand that we are in a government shutdown, and I hope that we can resolve this very soon. Have you been able to take any steps that would mitigate any sort of delays that we might see due to the shutdown for the implementation of E15 year-round?
I'm afraid not on the E15. It's not a court-ordered deadline for us, and it's not considered an emergency. At this point, we can only work on the court-ordered deadlines, the emergencies, or the constitutional authorities, such as assisting my preparation for the confirmation hearing.
Okay, and we know that just this past Monday, the president also reiterated again that he wants to see E15 year-round, so we will hope for the best as we work through the government shutdown. When President Trump was elected, RIN prices were more than $1 at that time, and during 2016 and 2017, we saw over 4 dozen small refinery exemption petitions granted during that time period. In the last 2 years, RIN prices have dramatically dropped, so they are down to 10 cents and lower now. So with the RIN prices being so much lower today than they were 2 years ago, do you agree that this means there is less economic hardship associated with having to purchase those RINs?
The RIN prices are certainly one criteria that is looked at to determine the economic hardship. The analysis for that is conducted by the Department of Energy, and then they send their recommendations over to EPA.
Okay, and in terms addressing then those that are sent over from the DOE, I do understand that they evaluate for that hardship, and I would say with RINs being 1/10 of what they were many years ago, the prices, the DOE evaluates for the hardship and makes that recommendation to you at the EPA. What is the EPA's role in granting or denying a full or partial waiver? Can you describe that process to me?
It's done by our technical team and the Air Office, where they review the information from the Department of Energy and then move forward with a recommendation to the Assistant Administrator for Air, and then on to myself for a recommendation on whether to grant a full, partial, or no relief.
Can you assure me then that you will be examining those exemptions and not giving blanket exemptions as it appears has been done in the past by your predecessor?
Yes, we will be examining each one individually to make sure that each one is warranted individually.
Okay, because certainly we understand the potential for hardship out there, but we don't agree that every exemption that has been given in the past has been due to a hardship. I do want to touch on, I just have 1 minute left. I do want to touch on WOTUS, and again, thank you very much for working on that issue. Our Iowa farmers and ranchers are very, very appreciative of the work that has been done. Can you elaborate on how the replacement rule provides more clarity to our farmers and landowners than the original 2015 rule?
Absolutely. We, as I mentioned earlier, we specifically define what is a water of the United States, and we also define what is not. So we're very clear on both what is and what is not. And again, my overarching goal for the WOTUS program is so that the property owner can decide for themselves whether or not they have a water of the U.S. without having to hire outside consultants or attorneys to do that for them.
And I thank you for that, and I will give my time back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Ernst. Senator Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. I know a lot of my colleagues have brought this up, but you are aware of the intergovernmental plan on climate change, sir?
Yes, sir.
And
yes,
you disagree with the findings of it?
No, I didn't. I have not disagreed with the findings.
I guess I'm asking you. You're aware of it?
No, I don't disagree with the findings. I've been briefed once by my staff. They gave me a number of, by my career staff, they gave me a number of background information to read, and we had scheduled additional briefings on it for early January, and those have been postponed. But no, I don't disagree with the findings. I'm still examining the findings. I'm trying to understand what was in it and what was covered by the assessment.
And I find that frustrating because of the urgency of the challenges we face before us. Again, the review of it talks about the urgency to keep reduce greenhouse gas emissions and keep global warming between below 1.5 degrees, and the really potentially catastrophic natural disasters, food shortages, extreme heat, literally potentially seeing upwards of $1 trillion of damage to U.S. property. What about the National Climate Assessment issued by the 13 federal agencies, including the EPA, that was issued last November? You're familiar with that, sir?
Yeah, that was what I was. I'm sorry. I thought that's what you were asking me about.
No, the IPCC report.
Oh, the IPCC. I'm talking to my staff about the U.S. government assessment.
And again, sir, this is cross agencies that have concluded that we are going to suffer impacts, heat-related deaths, coastal floodings, infrastructure damage. And in light of the ICC scientists, the federal government scientists, it ranged from the United States military to your very own agency, the compelling, the overwhelming science of this, there's this urgency to move as quickly as possible. But yet, it seems in the light of this, the consistency of the different regulatory changes you're making fly in the face. And I know other of my colleagues have brought this up. But, you know, when it comes to the clean car standards, according to the EPA's own analysis, of the proposal, you estimated that over time your recommended approach would result in 7.4 billion tons of additional carbon pollution. Do you not agree with that?
What my career staff have told me is that it's a slight incremental increase from what the Obama administration's proposal was. You know, I think what a lot of people don't understand is on the Obama numbers, they offered a number of exemptions so that the actual number itself, in effect, would be lower than what they're.
Sir, I'm pulling from the EPA's own analysis. You may call it slight, 7.4 billion tons of additional carbon pollution. Your Clean Power Plan repeal, which when it released its proposed Affordable Clean Energy Rule, repealing and replacing the Clean Power Plan, again, your own analysis from your own agency estimates that this will lead to substantially higher levels of greenhouse gas warming. If you go to your air pollution from oil and gas infrastructure. Again, your own scientists, EPA releases proposed rules, and looking at the methane, really one of the most very powerful greenhouse gas. Again, your own analysis shows that your weakening of this rule will lead to substantially more greenhouse gas pollution. Your air pollution from landfills efforts. Later in October, you released a proposed rule to delay for 2 years, if I'm correct, sir, the deadline for landfill emission guidelines that would limit these very dangerous methane emissions and other pollutions. Again, this 2-year delay seems to again add to that larger problem. It just seems a consistency of actions you are taking to weakening rules, to undermining the sense of urgency that cross agencies are telling us that we face growing challenges, not just now, but really over the next 25 years. And I'm just wondering if your mission of the EPA, which is to protect human health and the environment, which you swore an oath to, and to faithfully discharge these duties, yet you seem to be consistently doing things that undermines the health and safety of this nation, the economic well-being of our nation, and frankly put into further peril, not just our country, but the planet. And so I'm trying to understand what is motivating this. I don't want to be cynical in that question, but why are you pulling back on regulations that will ultimately help us to deal with what our climate scientists say that we need to do in terms of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions?
I believe we are moving forward on a proactive basis on the ACE regulation. I believe that that is going to show a 34% reduction in CO2. You know, in the course of the regulatory analysis for each of our regulations, we do a number of different scenarios and a number of different data runs. I'll be happy to supply information to you in writing, but my career staff tell me that our proposal is going to get us a 34% reduction in CO2, and the Obama proposal would have gotten between 33 and 35% reduction.
So just for, I know my time has expired, I'd like to just introduce to the record the data from his own scientists that show what he's saying just does not hold water and contradict the claims that he's making.
You know, without objection, I'd like to interject that the EPA's decision to withdraw the so-called Clean Power Plan, I believe was the right one. 27 states challenged the Clean Power Plan in court. The Supreme Court stayed the rule. It wasn't just bad policy. It was against the law. Senator Braun.
Thank you. It's good to be on a committee like this. It means a lot to me. I've been a steward of the land for over 30 years. I've always felt that conservatives need to do a better job of talking about conservation and talking about the things that, you know, we believe in that really make a difference. Been a tree farmer for nearly 30 years, involved in agriculture, used it in the campaign. I started the Ecology Club back in high school. So what we're talking about here is important. To me, I always view something in the process that you look at how you're going to accomplish the goal. And I think clean air and clean water is important to everyone. I also look at the fact that over the weekend, and I know it's been discussed here before, I had 3 different farmers approach me about, you know, dealing with the technicalities of waters of the U.S. So I'm going to ask you a couple specific questions, and then I want to get your viewpoint on how we navigate this dynamic of wanting to adhere to what I think all of us believe in: clean air, clean water, good health, and then the practicality of doing what you do through the EPA to make sure that we take care of the big picture and not unduly complicate lives for people, you know, on the firing line. Waters of the U.S. The ruling as given in 2015, has it changed at all in the meantime, or is it in the process of being looked at?
Well, the 2015 Obama proposal was stayed by some courts, has been implemented by others. So we have right now we have a patchwork quilt of what is the current regulatory process for waters of the United States, which is why we came out with our proposal in December to rewrite and redo the waters of the United States going forward. And I believe that we're going to provide the certainty that the American public needs in order to protect the waters of the United States.
So in my state of Indiana, is the regulation component being administered more through state agencies trying to figure out what the ruling is or the interpretation of it, or is it being mandated more from the EPA? In other words, I get the feeling that in our case that we might be not fully understanding, you know, what that regulation is, and then maybe being overbearing in the enforcement of it.
Well, it is. It's a rulemaking in conjunction with the Army Corps of Engineers, and they're the ones that that issue the permits on the ground, and will be working with your constituents in Indiana. And again, it's varying from state to state right now, based upon the circuit courts, as far as in the district courts. I mean, as far as which standard is in place, the prior to 2015 or the current 2015.
And then what is your goal to have that fully clarified so farmers, state agencies know what is what?
We issued our proposal in December. It's out for public comment. I don't believe it's been published yet in the Federal Register because of the shutdown, but our goal is to have that rulemaking completed before the end of this year.
Okay. And then do you consider yourself a conservationist, and how will you measure your own success in this job once you get into it?
I do consider myself a conservationist. I am a Eagle Scout. I'm an avid hiker, camper. I still hike. I still camp. When I shared with you when I met with you last week, so far, and I'm sorry to send it off, but so far my favorite job in my life has been as a Boy Scouts summer camp counselor when I was in college for 3 summers. I'm a big believer in the outdoors, and I think success will be that we have moved the ball forward on reducing pollution, and we've helped. And I want to go back to what I said in the opening statement: helping communities that are ravaged by Superfund sites. It greatly impacts low-income Americans, oftentimes, in most cases, minority communities, and to try to help those communities. Some of the Superfund sites that we've cleaned up and that we're getting cleaned up are contaminated by lead. These are areas, these are communities where actually people and families are living today, and to get those areas cleaned up so that those children are not exposed to lead is very important. There's one site that I didn't mention in my opening statement in Colorado where it was on track to get it cleaned up, I think, over 20 years, and we were speeding that up. We're going to get that cleaned up the next few years so that we won't have 2 generations of children growing up in low-income housing subjected to lead in their ground.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Deputy Administrator Wheeler, as you know, I'm very proud that my state is home to EPA's Region 5 office, which features civil servants who are leaders in the fields of water quality, Superfund cleanup, and Great Lakes restoration. I am, however, concerned that EPA Regional Administrator Kathy Stepp and other political appointees are working to undermine that important work. An ATSDR report published last year indicated an elevated cancer risk in the community of Willowbrook, Illinois, as a result of being next to a facility that uses ethylene oxide, a known carcinogen. And at this point, I do want to thank you for how accessible you have been to me and to Senator Durbin on this issue, and numerous phone calls that you personally got on, meeting with us in person. So thank you for how accessible you've been. It's been a nice change from your predecessor. However, recently, my office received alarming information alleging that senior political appointees instructed EPA personnel not to inspect any facilities in Region 5 that emits ethylene oxide. And then yesterday evening, when we checked the EPA's own public enforcement tool, the ECHO tool, we found that there has been no ethylene oxide inspection across the country in at least the last 6 months. This disclosure is incredibly disappointing to me. The EPA Office of Inspector General should immediately begin an independent investigation into this allegation that political appointees within the EPA are issuing orders to not conduct ethylene oxide inspections. Will you commit now to joining me in requesting that the EPA OIG initiate an investigation into this public health matter?
Well, first, I'd like to talk to my staff and find out what is going on there. This is news to me, so I'd like to know whether or not it's accurate before I go further with that.
I think we ran the check just yesterday evening after you and I had spoken. Will you at least commit to issuing a document retention order to all personnel in Region 5 and promise to me that EPA will monitor all facilities in my state that emit this carcinogen?
I know that we are monitoring a number of facilities that release ethylene oxide, not just in your region, but across the country. We're looking at all of them. The Willowbrook facility that you mentioned, we've had a couple of public meetings there where we've discussed the monitoring data with the residents of the community, and we're looking at the emissions at other facilities around the country, and I know that that is taking place.
What about issuing a document retention order to all personnel, as I will be requesting an IG inspection?
If there's an issue there, certainly we would want those documents retained, but not just for this, but for anything. We maintain all of our documents.
Thank you. Right before the holidays and the government shutdown, you announced the release of the administration's long-delayed lead action plan.
Yes.
I was disappointed to see that this plan walks back earlier goals on eliminating lead exposure. In fact, the new plan has the objective to reduce children's exposure as opposed to eliminate their exposure in homes and child-occupied facilities with lead-based hazards. Will you commit EPA to the goal of eliminating, not just reducing, but eliminating lead exposure in children?
It is certainly our goal to eliminate lead exposure in children, and we do want to do that. We're moving forward with a number of regulatory programs to accomplish that. The lead dust rule that I mentioned earlier, our lead and copper rule. This would be the first time in over 20 years. And we're taking, we take very seriously lead contamination at Superfund sites around the country.
Thank you. Will you immediately reinstate Dr. Ruth Etzel, who led the Office of Children's Health Protection and was abruptly put on leave?
I'm sorry, what were you asking about Dr. Etzel?
Will you reinstate her?
She is on investigative leave because of allegations by her employees, and I can't go into more details in a public setting because of personnel issues, but I'd be happy to, through the oversight function of the committee, to brief you. I think we have to go through the chairman to do that. Okay. I want to make sure that my general counsel is involved to go into more detail about the circumstances around that.
Thank you. And as some of my colleagues across the aisle have mentioned, the state of renewable fuels in this industry in this country is at a turning point. And over the last 6 months, we've seen more ethanol plants sold, idled, or closed than ever before. Meanwhile, EPA is granting the world's largest refining companies these so-called hardship waivers. And my colleague, Senator Ernst, brought this up, the issue of these hardship waivers. These companies are earning record profits, billions with a B. The CEOs of these companies have even pointed to the fact that they were able to obtain these hardship waivers on their earnings calls as contributing to their profitability. You've promised to finalize a waiver for E15 blends by May 31st. Will you also promise that you will end this abuse of the hardship waivers by companies like Exxon or Chevron?
Senator, the hardship waiver is based on the refinery itself, not the refiner. So it's based on the actual refinery, and it doesn't matter who the parent company is. There could be a hardship at a refinery, and what we want to make sure happens is that just because you're a large company, if a refinery is not economical, we don't want those shut down because of this program. Oftentimes, these small refineries are located in the Rocky Mountains and other areas where they're the only supplier of gasoline in their region. So we have to base it according to both the statute and the regulations on the size of the refinery, not the refiner.
The issue we have here, though, is that...
The senator's time's expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Wheeler, thank you for your service to our country and your willingness to take on this job. I also want to thank your family. As you know, these jobs oftentimes entail the whole team, so thank you. I know some of them are here, and we really appreciate you guys being here, and I'm sure you're proud of your spouse or your dad or who's at the chair, so thank you. I appreciate also the time you spent with me. I think one of the themes here is how responsive you are to Democrats and Republicans. That's a really important part of the job. Our discussion yesterday on a number of Alaska-related issues, the PM 2.5 non-attainment problem in Fairbanks and North Pole, Alaska, working on clean water issues in my state, particularly in rural communities, cleaning up ANCSA, contaminated lands, which the ranking member and I had a bill last year that passed that helped do that. So transboundary mining issues, which are a big challenge in Alaska. So I'm not going to go into each of those. We got a commitment. One commitment, though, I do want to get from you is to get up to Alaska soon after your confirmation. Can I get a commitment from you on that?
Yes, Senator, I'd be happy to.
Maybe even if I invite you in the winter. It's 45 below in Fairbanks right now, so you got to be a little tough to come up. But
August sounds great.
Well, no. All right. Well, maybe I'm not going to be so supportive. No, I'm just kidding. So, listen, this is a confirmation hearing that's supposed to look at your past qualifications and experience for the job. And what was your first job out of law school?
My first job was a career employee at EPA working in the toxics program.
Okay, so you were a career employee at the EPA, and you did that for how long?
For 4 years.
And you received some awards, I believe, during that time?
I did. I received 3 bronze medals.
Okay, and what does that mean?
Well, they weren't gold or silver, but they were still very important.
You got medals, though, right?
Proud of them.
From the EPA as a career employee?
Yes, as a career employee.
Okay. Well, I think that's important. You'd probably be one of the first career employees to run the agency, wouldn't you?
I believe Steve Johnson, who was administrator under President Bush, was probably the first.
Okay, and then you came to this committee, which has oversight of the EPA and all the issues covered. How long were you at this committee?
14 years.
14 years as counsel and staff director?
I was the staff director and chief counsel for the last 6 years that I worked here.
Okay, so essentially you were the main guy running the committee.
I mean,
had a
with
lot
the
of
exception
help.
of the senators.
I had a lot of help, and there was a chairman with the gavel. Yes.
All right. Well, I think it was Senator Inhofe, so I don't want to get in trouble here, but you know what I mean. So we're talking almost 20 years, 18, in public sector, either at the EPA or at the committee overseeing the EPA, correct?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. I think that's really strong qualifications for this job, and hopefully my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will at least acknowledge that, because it's obvious. You come highly qualified in the public sector. So we appreciate that, your service to America.
Thank you, sir.
Let me ask, because my colleagues, and unfortunately I hope the media that's watching this hearing will write about your almost 20 years of public sector experience, because what they love to write about is, quote, a lobbyist for a coal company. Okay, so you were a lobbyist.
I was.
Can you talk about what you did in that job? And I know Murray Energy comes up. What was your big issue with those, with representing them? You represent a lot more.
Yes, I represented over 20 different clients during my time as a consultant. They ranged from companies to trade associations to NGOs. I represented an air quality management district in California. For Murray Energy, for the last 4 years that I represented Murray Energy, the #1 issue that I was asked to work on each of those 4 years was to try to shore up the United Mine Workers pension and health care funds.
Okay.
They're underfunded. We were successful on the health care side, but we were not successful in getting the pension bill through Congress before I left. But I'm very proud of the service that I did there. I'm very proud of the work that
Good.
I did on behalf.
Well, look, I hope our friends in the media might want to cover that issue as well. And I'm sure Senator Capito and Manchin also appreciate that hard work. We all do, right? I have miners, coal miners in my state. I have miners in my state, and they're great Americans. Let me ask one final question. Oceans and ocean pollution and plastics. This is a huge issue. It's an issue that we've made a lot of bipartisan progress on. I'm pointing to Senator Whitehouse's empty seat there. He and I had a bill last year. The President signed. The Trump administration is doing great work on this, arguably much better than the previous administration. We're gonna soon put forward our Save Our Seas Act 2.0. Save Our Seas Act 1.0 was signed by the President just a couple months ago, with Senator Whitehouse and I both in the Oval Office with the President. Do you have any ideas that we can move forward with on addressing the big challenges we have, ocean pollution, plastics, and the role that you have already played in that regard with regard to the EPA?
Perhaps the nominee could either very briefly, but answer in writing as well.
Certainly. We have a
or maybe
program.
Commit to work with us, just to keep it short.
Happy to commit to work with you, sir. And I consider it a very big problem internationally, and something that we are on top of.
Great. Thank you very much.
I would like to interject that the nominee has received praise from the United Mine Workers of America. Cecil Roberts, the United Mine Workers International President, has said the following of Mr. Wheeler, and I'm going to submit the statement to the record. He said, "He will be a reasonable voice within the agency and will recognize the impact on both the workers and the mining communities that are directly affected as EPA develops future emissions regulations." Well, that'll be submitted to the record without objection. Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wheeler, you earlier said that you thought that we were having a climate issue and not a climate crisis. Is that correct?
I did say that, yes, sir.
Okay. So let me just begin by saying I think that you're 100% wrong. We are having a climate crisis. How do I know? Well, I know because 13 federal agencies, including your own, in November, issued a report. And here's what all 13 federal agencies said, that our efforts do not yet approach the scale necessary to avoid substantial damages to the economy, environment, and human health. Now, how did President Trump respond when asked about the conclusion of the National Climate Assessment that your agency helped to produce, that climate change could devastate the American economy. He said, I don't believe it. Do you agree with Donald Trump?
I believe President Trump is referring to the media reports of the assessment itself. And I questioned the media reports as well because they focused on the worst case scenario, and they also focused on one study that was actually not in the report, and that's the study that said that there would be a 10% hit to the GDP. And I believe that's what he was referring to, and that was what I raised questions about after the assessment was released.
So you don't agree with the broader conclusion that the actions we're taking do not approach the scale necessary to avoid substantial damage to our country? You don't agree with that?
No, I did not say that, Senator.
I'm asking you that question. Do you agree with that conclusion?
I've been briefed by my career staff after the assessment came out, and I've asked a number of questions, and we have a number of follow-up briefings scheduled for them to go over the findings in the assessment.
This report came out in November. You're the head of the EPA. We're heading to the end of January.
I did not review the report before it came out. There was no political interference in the assessment. And we've been shut down for the last few weeks. But I've been briefed by my staff once on the assessment, and we have several briefings scheduled before I become before I can make further public comments.
That's unacceptable. I mean, you're looking to be confirmed as the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, and we're having a hearing on your worthiness for this job, and you very conveniently haven't had enough time yet to review whether or not there's an extra level of urgency to this problem. You're saying that it's a worst-case scenario that they're talking about, huh? And so, therefore, you don't have to deal with it. But the worst-case scenario is your proposal to roll back the fuel economy standards in our country. The worst-case scenario is your proposal to roll back the rule to reduce emissions dramatically from the coal-burning plants in our country. And that's where it's relevant that you are a former coal industry lobbyist who is sitting here. Your proposal to roll back those regulations. That's the worst-case scenario, what you are proposing, sir. So, my question to you is, in terms of fuel economy standards, we import 2.5 million barrels of oil a day from OPEC. 2.5 million barrels a day. We have young men and women all over the Middle East protecting that oil coming in. Do you think that that is a worst-case scenario, or do you think that that is just something that we should accept by not, in fact, increasing the fuel economy standards? Because, interestingly, under the Obama standards, we back out 2.5 million barrels of oil a day, every day, that we would import from OPEC. Do you think that's a worst-case scenario, or do you think that's something that we should maintain and increase as our goal, Mr. Wheeler?
Well, Senator, first of all, we did not roll back the Clean Power Plan because the Clean Power Plan never took effect. It was stayed by the Supreme Court. What our proposal does is follow the Clean Air Act, follow the court decisions.
The effect of your decision is to not implement the Clean Power Plan, which dramatically reduces greenhouse gases.
Because it went outside the bounds of the Clean Air Act. What we put forward is a proposal that follows the Clean Air Act and follows the law.
Yeah, well, here's the problem that I have, sir, with you. In this hearing, you're putting up a smokescreen to ensure that there is an advancement of Donald Trump's dirty policies. And the impact on ordinary families, their health, the health of our country, the security of our country is absolutely urgent. The American people want higher fuel economy standards. They want higher standards for reducing pollutants going into the lungs of the people in our country. And what you're here doing is defending Donald Trump's policy. I don't believe it, he said. Well, the American people believe it because they know that it's American scientists that came to this conclusion, including your own. And you can say you haven't had time to read it, but that in and of itself, from my perspective, is a disqualification for having the job which you are sitting here seeking to be nominated.
I didn't say I didn't read it. I said that I haven't finished.
There will be order.
Briefed on it by my staff, sir.
The Senator's time has expired. I would like to interject the EPA's decision to review the vehicle standards was the right one. In 2017, the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers sent a letter to the EPA stating, if left unchanged, these standards could cause up to 1.1 million Americans to lose their jobs due to lost vehicle sales, and low-income households would be hit the hardest. Unanimous consent to enter this statement into the record, and without objection, it will be done. Senator
Mr.
Kramer.
Chairman, before you do that,
Senator
I would
Carper,
like to ask
please.
unanimous consent to submit for the record a letter I sent to Mr. Wheeler last month asking about a possible coordinated campaign between Mr. Wheeler and the White House to bury the results of the report mentioned by Senator Markey and other materials as well related to EPA's efforts to take us backward on climate change, on a climate change crisis.
Without objection. Senator Kramer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Wheeler, for being here and your willingness to serve in this capacity. I believe that when you and I sat down and met in my transitional office, I hadn't been appointed to this committee yet, but you were telling me it was the best committee in Congress.
And I stand by that. It is the best committee in Congress.
I appreciate that. And before I forget, I want to, right up front, also invite you to my state of North Dakota, and you can come in August if you like, but January and February, not quite as cold as Alaska, but you could bring your family and go camping, as you know. All right. And we'd love to have you. And it's especially I'd like to bring you to the Energy and Environmental Research Center at the University of North Dakota, where we could have a discussion on these and several other topics that are important. And I also want to thank you for your very good work on the rollback of waters of the U.S. and coming up with a what I'm sure is a much more common sense and legal definition of a waters of the U.S. Same with regard to the Clean Power Plan being replaced by ACE. I mean, while I appreciate the passion from some on the other side, I'm quite certain that ignoring a Supreme Court stay isn't in your authority, is it?
No, it is not. We have to follow the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I would think so. So thank you for that. Certainly, I also want to piggyback a little bit on what Senator Ernst was talking about with regard to the year-round E15. That was something that I'd advocated for a long time, and certainly she had, and other, not just advocates of ethanol, but I think, again, as conservatives, we like to eliminate barriers to markets. While some might argue over the RFS or they might argue over the volume set, again, the law is the law. And I think it was an appropriate move, and I congratulate you and appreciate what you and the President did in making that commitment. I want to, with regard to the RFS, you know, there are as many opinions and as divergent opinions in North Dakota, as you might imagine, as there are in this room on the RFS and in what it should do and what it shouldn't do. I would like to ask you, though, what's your professional opinion on what happens in 2022? Because I think sometimes we discuss this issue, you know, past each other without a clear understanding of what exactly the law does in 2022 and what options there are, and what happens if we do nothing.
If Congress does nothing by 2022, then the implementation and operation of the program would be up to the agency, up to the EPA, and we would have we could continue the program as is. There's a number of different options we could do. We've not started to look at what we might do in 2022. I know there's legislation, at least in the House, on extending the program further, but we will have to make some decisions as far as what the RFS program looks like post-2022.
So would it be your recommendation that Congress get together with all of our divergent views and find a prescriptive solution that doesn't leave a lot of, too much discretion over the course of administration after administration?
I think it is always helpful for Congress to write the legislation that directs the agency to implement the programs. And I think where the EPA has gotten into trouble in the past on the Obama administration with the Clean Power Plan is when they went beyond the law.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Thank you for that. Now, just as a matter of following up a little bit on what Senator Sullivan was talking about, and as I've sat here, and I apologize, Mr. Chairman, for being late. I had my first day of presiding over the Senate this morning. Not nearly as exciting as this, I might add. But I'm perplexed a little bit. Well, in fact, let's go back to what Senator Sullivan said. And it occurred to me as he was talking, did those 18 years as a professional staff person at the EPA prepare you well for your work in private industry?
It did, and I think my overall career, both implementing laws at the EPA in the beginning of my career, to helping to draft laws here when I worked in the Senate, to talking to a wide variety of different clients, potential clients, when I was in the private sector, to see how the regulations, the laws were impacting hardworking people who are trying to make a living.
And I would suspect that your further work in industry prepared you well for this job, and I want to appreciate that. And I'm just, with time running out, I would just like to propose some scenarios like, should we bar farmers from being Secretary of Agriculture? Should we bar doctors from being the head of Health and Human Services, or attorneys from being the Attorney General, or bankers from, being head of the Treasury Department and whatnot? I just think this is a very funny path to go down, realizing this is my first confirmation hearing. Maybe I don't know everything I should.
I agree with you. I don't think we should ban farmers from being head of the USDA or doctors at HHS and bankers of the whatever the bankers the head of.
The treasurer. Thank you. I yield back, Mr.
Thank you so very much. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Wheeler. And
thank you.
I do want to associate myself with some of the comments made by the ranking member and others regarding climate change, auto emission standards, mercury rules, and I do appreciate your working with Senator Cardin and I and others on the Chesapeake Bay, and look forward to continuing that work together. But I wanted to use my time today to talk about this shameful and unnecessary government shutdown. We're now 26 days into it, longest government shutdown in U.S. history. My understanding is there are about 13,000 EPA employees that are currently furloughed. Is that correct, approximately?
Approximately, yes, sir.
And that there are approximately 891 who are on the job. Is that approximately right?
That sounds pretty exact, 891. But it varies from day to day. We bring back people to work on specific issues.
Right, including some that you brought on to prepare for this hearing. Is that right?
Yes, Senator.
And you've worked at the EPA. You've had experience. In your experience, are these hardworking, dedicated civil servants?
Yes, they are. I have full confidence in the EPA staff.
And have they shared, some of them, their stories of hardship with you, what they're experiencing now because of the shutdown?
Yes, and I was an EPA employee back in the 90s when it was shut down, and I remember the frustration at the time.
Yeah.
And my heart goes out for the EPA employees and all the employees.
And I appreciate that, because they are definitely stuck in the middle of something they had nothing to do with. I just want to read some of the statements I'm getting from EPA employees. I'm sure you are as well. Quote, I work for the EPA and have been furloughed. Then it goes on to say, I have triplets that are in college, and it is very tough to meet their education needs and pay our bills without my salary, which is the major income source for our family. My son has Crohn's disease requiring expensive medical treatments. And she also goes on to say our younger employees at EPA have just started out and unable to make rent and loan payments. Here's another employee who's been furloughed. She actually may be here in the audience today. I work for EPA. I love my job and feel like my program is important to protecting public health. She goes on to say, my son is a junior in high school. I found out yesterday that fees for the AP exams are due January 31st. I don't see how I can afford to pay these fees. He is going to lose the opportunity to pass 4 AP tests. Ironically, one of them is U.S. government. Another one, 15-year-old student, Montgomery County, Maryland. I'm a 15-year-old student. My father, like many people in this area, is a federal employee working at the EPA. He's now missed an entire paycheck from his shutdown. Will likely miss another if this keeps up. Please vote to override the veto. Of course, we don't have a chance to override the veto because we haven't passed legislation that's pending here in the United States Senate. Mr. Wheeler, I have here in my hand the mission statement for the EPA. First line, the mission of EPA is to protect human health and the environment. EPA works to ensure that, and it goes on to list a number of things, starting with Americans have clean air, land, and water. I assume you're familiar with the EPA mission statement, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
And there's nothing in this statement about how the EPA is the lead agency when it comes to issues of border security, is there?
Border security?
Border security, yeah. Homeland security.
No, so we do a lot of border work. There's a lot of pollution. We have a lot of
I'm referring,
Mexico, but
Mr. Wheeler, to the security aspects of the job with respect to border security? That's done primarily by Department of Homeland Security, is it not? This is not a trick question. Okay.
No, well, I'm just, because we do a lot of
I know you do stuff along the border, yes. But here's my question. You're familiar that last August, the United States Senate passed the appropriations bill for the EPA by a vote of 92-6. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Sir.
It was an overwhelming vote.
Yes.
That bill is now before the Senate again as part of other bills that had overwhelming bipartisan support in the United States Senate. And the Republican leader says that we can't vote on those bills because the President of the United States won't sign them. And my question to you is, why won't the President, you're the senior administration official here today in the middle of the shutdown in this committee, why won't the President sign a bill to fund the EPA, which has nothing to do with the government shutdown, a bill that passed this body 92-6? Can you just explain to people, including the people who wrote into me, why that is the position of the President of the United States?
Well, the President takes border security very seriously.
I'm asking you about the EPA bill, Mr. Wheeler. So
this is
why is it that he refuses to support a bill that passed the Senate by 92-6? We care about border security too. Why is it that he says he won't sign a totally unrelated bill? Why is that?
Well, I believe the President's been very upfront about his desire to have all the appropriation bills passed at the same time, along with the border security. The border security, as you mentioned, is outside of our authority at the EPA. I do want to take a moment to thank you for helping pass the legislation guaranteeing that all the furloughed employees will get back pay. That was very important to the employees. On behalf of my employees at EPA, I thank you for your work on that in Congress. I think that was a very important message to send.
Well, I'm grateful that you mentioned that. Thank you for saying that. And I just have one request as we leave here. The President has not yet signed that bill. Will you urge the President of the United States to sign that bill?
I think it's important to have all the appropriation bills signed along with the border security that the President, that the American people want.
We passed this in the Senate and the House separately, right? And I have no reason to believe the President's not going to sign it. In fact, the Republican leader said that the President was going to sign it. My question is, would you, on behalf of your employees, urge the President to sign the bill?
I'm sure that he wants to reopen the government as much as you do.
No, this is not a question of reopening the government. This is a bill that's already passed during the government shutdown to provide some confidence and certainty at the end of the day people will be made whole. I appreciate your mentioning the importance of that bill. On behalf of your employees at EPA, can you ask the President to sign the bill?
Senator, I also know that this is part of a larger negotiation, and I hope that all the parties can come to the table and negotiate and end the shutdown as soon as possible.
Well, this Senate, on a bipartisan basis, was able to do this for the reasons you say in the middle of a shutdown. I hope the President will sign the bill, and I really encourage you to let your employees know that you support the bill.
Senator's time has expired. This is the end of the first round of questioning. We're going to proceed, if we could, to the second round. I think that probably fewer members will want to ask a second round of questions, but we do have a roll call vote coming up at 12:30. So, I want to go into the round two. I understand that when considering a small refineries petition for hardship relief under the renewable fuel standard of RFS, the EPA consults with the Department of Energy, as you mentioned.
Yes.
These two agencies conduct a detailed, objective analysis based on the small refineries' confidential business information. Under the Clean Air Act, the agencies must look at each small refinery as an individual basis, which you had mentioned in a comment earlier, regardless of whether the refinery is part of a larger company. Is that your understanding of the law?
Yes, it is, sir.
Okay. Now, I also want to thank you for withdrawing the Obama administration's proposed duplicative rule on groundwater monitoring on in situ uranium recovery. This rule was a midnight regulation the EPA issued the day before President Obama left office. So when you talk about a midnight regulation, that by definition really fits it. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, our nation's principal nuclear regulator, stated that there was no health or safety justification for the rule. The NRC has also said that the rule interfered with its jurisdiction over uranium recovery activities. To ensure this doesn't happen again, I've written to EPA asking the agency to sign a memorandum of understanding which would clarify the NRC and the EPA's jurisdiction over those activities. Do you know if his work has begun on that memorandum of understanding? And if not,
it has begun. It began before the end of last year. At this point, we're not working on it as part of the shutdown, but it has begun, sir. Yes.
You know, the cost of regulations coming out of the EPA was staggering before President Trump took office. According to the Office of Management and Budget, major EPA rules cost between $54 billion and $86 billion a year between the years 2006 and 2016. That total was more than the cost of major rules from 7 other cabinet-level federal agencies combined. 7 agencies combined. Has this administration taken a hard look at those costs, and in your opinion, has the EPA better balanced regulatory costs with environmental protection?
We have, and we have a cost-benefit rule that we proposed in early last year. We received 3,200 comments on it. We're reviewing those comments and plan to go forward with that, which will help define how we look at cost-benefit analysis across the board.
You know, I've seen some stories in the press that the EPA enforcement cases have fallen. In my opinion, how many enforcement cases are filed isn't the best metric to measure the EPA's successes. Our goal should be to actually make sure that people are following the law in the first place. This is called the compliance assurance, making sure that businesses across the country comply with the law up front so that enforcement actions aren't needed. What's the EPA doing to improve compliance assurance?
We are working very hard on compliance assurance, and I think the agency has for a number of years. And I think the more compliance assurance that we have, the fewer enforcement actions that we need to take. But there's been a lot of misleading information in the news media about our enforcement program. I'd like to correct 2 items real fast, if you don't mind. Last summer, a group, EDGI, released a report on what they thought our enforcement numbers were. We went over that, and we went over it again, and our career people went over it, and it appears as though they made some simple mathematical errors in their report. They claim, for example, that our administrative compliance orders were down 42%, but actually they were up 13%. And then just recently, Peer released a report on our criminal enforcement program. They said that we aren't making the criminal referrals. We don't actually make criminal referrals. We make requests for prosecutorial assistance. And at the agency, the metric that we use is to track the number of new criminal enforcement cases that open each year. And last year, we opened more criminal enforcement cases than in 2017, and that reversed a downward trend that started in 2011. So since 2011, we've been on a steady decline. Last year, we reversed the decline for the first time.
Thank you. Anything else that from the first round, that questions that someone has come to you and said, gee, I'd like to clarify something?
Well, I would like to clarify, because there's been a lot of discussion on our CAFE proposal, and a lot of it having to do with the CO2 emissions in reductions from the CAFE proposal. And yes, under President Obama's proposal on CAFE, that was their one goal for the program, is energy efficiency, CO2. We have multiple goals for the program, multiple policy goals, including protecting lives. And under our proposal, we estimate that there will be 1,000 lives saved a year under our CAFE proposal. And so I neglected to mention that earlier, but I think that's very important for everyone to understand. It will decrease the cost of a new car by $2,300, and that will get older cars off the road. And when you get an older car off the road, people are buying safer cars, and it will save 1,000 lives a year. And I think that is a very important fact to get out there in the public.
Thank you. Senator Inhofe, you have a unanimous consent.
I do have a unanimous consent request. I'd like to submit these 2 studies into the record. Both are from the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Economics, the University of Illinois, Urbana. The first study is from September 2018. Its conclusion, quote, little if any evidence that the blend rate for ethanol has been reduced by small refinery exemptions. And the second one, quote, the updated analysis in this article shows even less evidence that the blend rate for ethanol has been reduced by SREs.
Without objection. Senator Carper.
If I could, a couple of UC requests, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record articles to describe Mr. Wheeler's troubling decision to continue his predecessor's efforts to weaken EPA's enforcement power, including maintenance of the Sioux and Settle Directive, changes in the Clean Water Act enforcement, and the twice introduced proposal to eliminate the Office of Environmental Justice.
Without objection.
And second, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record materials that indicate that the safety analysis that Mr. Wheeler referred to with respect to the previous administration's CAFE proposals, that the safety analysis, which I think is badly flawed from this administration, that it I'd like to have for the record an analysis that indicates as much.
Well, without objection, and please feel free to proceed with your round 2 of questions.
Thank you. I've sat in this hearing room for 18 years, and I've always looked for, and I think my colleagues for the most part have done this as well, I always look for win-win situations. I always look for situations where we can have the good things for our air, our water, public health, and do so in a way that does not impinge or degrade economic opportunity, economic growth. I've raised in conversations with you, Mr. Wheeler, and here today, 3 instances where I believe we can do good things for our planet, for those of us who live here, and actually provide economic opportunity for American businesses. I've just come like 2 days ago, as I said earlier, with the cross-section of auto companies from all over the world. We talked about the fuel efficiency standards, tailpipe emission standards, and they are pleading for certainty. They have said to me repeatedly, we don't want to spend the next 4 or 5 years in a court battle with California and 13 other states, including Delaware, on what these standards should be. We need certainty, we need predictability, we need near-term relief, and in the out years, we can, with a lot of electric-powered vehicles and hydrogen-powered vehicles, we can strive for and meet much more rigorous standards for CAFE. I'm troubled by something you said to me. I think you said you've talked to the woman who runs CARB out in California, Mary Nichols, 3 times in, I think, 9 months about this. We're talking about the greatest source of carbon emissions on our planet is our mobile sources, our cars, trucks, and vans. California is critical to getting a deal. So are the other 13 states, including Delaware. And the idea that you've spoken with her, whether it's her fault, your fault, 3 times in 3/4 of a year, is just deeply troubling. And one of the thoughts that keeps coming back to me in this conversation today, this hearing today, is I don't feel a sense of urgency. We do in Delaware. I live in the lowest lying state in the country. Our state is sinking, the oceans are rising. We live here not too far away from a place called Ellicott City. They've had 2 500-year floods in a year. I live in not a very big state, but there are wildfires, bigger than the size of my state, in Oregon, in Montana, in Washington, in California, just in the last year. We used to measure rainfall by the inch, now we measure it by the foot. And one of the things I just don't sense here is a sense of urgency to do something about this. We had 13 agencies that came together and said, this is a huge issue and it's getting worse, not better. And they didn't do this because of something that Obama law would compel them to do. I think that was legislation signed by George Herbert Walker Bush many, many years ago. So I'm looking for some passion here. And I just don't feel it. And that's deeply troubling. And also looking for win-wins. And we talked about hydrofluorocarbons and the threat that they pose to our atmosphere, and this American technology that has a follow-on to HFCs. And there's a great interest in being able to adopt a Kigali treaty that actually allows for the phase down of HFCs and the introduction of replacements from American-made companies with American-made technologies. And it's not some wild-eyed, liberal, tree-hugging idea. I mean, this is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. This is the American Chemical Council. There's all these American businesses. And EPA is, rather than being a good partner in helping to expedite this and make it happen, if anything else, I think the agency's an impediment. And the other thing that I would say, I'll never forget, my colleagues have heard me say this before, I beg their indulgence. I'll never forget when Lamar Alexander and I, Senator Alexander and I, were working on a 4P legislation to deal with, you may recall this, to deal with sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, carbon, and mercury. And the issue that we're kind of hung up on was mercury. And the idea, can we actually reduce mercury emissions by as much as 80%? Lamar Alexander said, no, we can reduce it by 90%. We had a hearing right here, and a guy sat right there at the end of the table. Everybody was from a utility at this table and said, oh, we can't even get to 80%, much less 90%. The guy was from the representing the association that said, no, we can do better, they can do 90%. He said, they could do better than that. And you know what? They did. They reached 90% reduction. And if you look at the MATS rule, the reason why the utilities are essentially sanguine about this is they made the investments. It costs a third as much money to make the investments. It's actually working. And not only do we do, I think, a beneficial thing for children, infants, for those that haven't even been born, but we actually do a lot of, not collateral damage, but collateral good things, and reduce all the other particulate matter and all kinds of stuff to save lives. And to somehow say that that just doesn't add up enough, and in terms of cost-benefit analysis, for us just to say, all right, they got it right. They actually got something right in the Obama administration. And now it's on MATS and all these other folks, all these other stakeholders are for it, but maybe we should be as well. What we're afraid of is you're going to do something, your agency's going to do something that gives someone else, not EPA, but somebody else, the ability to come in and have standing in court and undo MATS, undo the mercury air toxic stand. That's what we're afraid of. That is what we're afraid of. And so those are three instances where I think we can have, I think a lot of us think we can have cleaner air, cleaner water, better public health, more jobs. And why we don't take that ball and run it right down the field, I don't know. I don't know. And that's what frustrates me, and I'm sure it's what frustrates me, others on this panel, and frankly, a lot of people in this audience might be watching. I don't normally give long speeches. I don't normally ask short questions and look for short answers, but respond to that if you would. I'm looking for passion. I'm looking for a sense of urgency. I'm looking for a real commitment. And that might not be your nature, but we need it. And I think this agency needs that kind of leadership.
Senator, and you and I have discussed the CAFE standard and a number of issues multiple times now, and I want you to understand and believe that I really do want a 50-state solution. I really do. When I've met with, when I said Mary Nichols, that was one-on-one meetings with Mary Nichols. It was 3 over the last 6 months. That doesn't mean we haven't been working with California more than that. I know she's met with other people at the agency. We've had technical meetings between her technical staff and our technical staff. There have been a lot more meetings than just those 3. Those were the 3 one-on-one meetings that I had with Mary Nichols in my office. We've also been on phone calls, and she's met with the Department of Transportation. Again, this is a joint rulemaking with DOT. But at the end of the day, I want a 50-state solution. I want a regulation that provides certainty to the consumers, the automobile manufacturers, and to all the interested parties. And that is what I want at the end of the day, and that's what I hope we can get.
P.S. Methylene chloride. I want you to impart a sense of urgency in getting a rule done on that. Something that was actually something that Scott Pruitt did that we thought was right. And here it is 2 years later, and we still haven't followed through on it. Let's get it done.
As I shared with you Tuesday, our hope had been to publish that last week. It is at OMB. It's saying they're ready to go as soon as the Federal Register opens. But that is something that I've taken seriously. And it's something that we spend a lot of time. I've spent a lot of personal time on that issue. And I hope we can get that out as quickly as possible.
Methylene chloride, for the record, is as you know, a paint stripper that kills people. Must be a really good paint stripper, but unfortunately, it kills people. Thank you.
Senator Inhofe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want our witness to recognize that I am not at all offended that you found your leadership in the Eagle Scouts to be more rewarding than your leadership under me for 14 years.
Thank you, Senator.
And also, I appreciate the fact that you brought up and someone else did, Senator Braun, I believe it was, brought up the fact that how much more that our landowners, property owners, are good stewards of their land. And this is kind of interesting because under the previous administration, Dan Ash was the head of the Fish and Wildlife, and he came at my invitation out to Oklahoma, and this is the first time that I think that in his career that he realized that this was true. He was actually in the western part of the state and in the central part of the state, and this is a recognition that I really appreciate. Since the previous questioner brought up the CAFE standards, let me just share with you something you already know, but it needs to be in the record, and that is that in 1975, the Congress created a law to help with the fuel shortage situation by establishing the corporate average fuel or CAFE standard. Now, we no longer have a fuel shortage, and yet that didn't stop the Obama administration and California from ensuring that standards kept increasing beyond what technology can do to force their electric car fantasies and the rest of us. Now, the consumers want trucks and SUVs. They make up about 2/3 of the market, and the electric vehicles don't even make up 1% of the nation's auto sales, but auto manufacturers are producing more and more of them. Why do you suppose that is?
I believe they're producing what the consumers want to buy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but what does this do to, I guess the follow-up question would be, is it your understanding that many car manufacturers are not technically complying with the current Obama standards?
Yes.
Aren't they paying penalties and cashing in credits to comply?
Yes.
Now, what does that do to the ultimate price to the consumer?
It adds additional price to the consumer. There is a misconception out there that all of the automobile manufacturers are currently complying with the CAFE standards. They are not. Several of them are not. There's a penalty basis built into the regulation, and they are paying penalties for not complying. And it's projected over the life, if the Obama regulations were to stay in place, that the amount of penalties will be increasing, I believe, up to $1 billion over the lifespan of the Obama regulations, and that those penalties would be passed on to the consumer.
And they will be passed on to the consumer. I mean, there's nothing else they can do to accommodate that. So I think that's important. I mean, is it really the role of government to dictate what people are buying in America? In enforcing that. That's something that I've watched and you've seen it over the years. It's something that we have a serious problem with. Mr. Wheeler, the EPA has been taking a lot of criticism for supposed lack of enforcement actions under Trump. Would you like to talk a little bit about the enforcement standards that have been imposed under your administration so far?
Absolutely. First of all, I think it's important to note that we did not have a political head of our enforcement office for all of 2017. Susan Bodine was not confirmed until the end of 2017, which is actually the first quarter of 2018. So we've only had a political head for the 3 quarters of 2018, yet our enforcement numbers, important enforcement numbers, are up. As I mentioned a little while ago, our criminal prosecutorial assistant, the number of criminal cases we opened was up in 2018 compared to 2017. We initiated 140 lead enforcement actions in fiscal year 2018 compared to 127 in 2017. And we're using all of our tools, including compliance assistance. The environmental benefits, as I mentioned in my opening statement, we've removed 809 million pounds of pollution and waste through enforcement actions in 2018, which is almost double what we removed in 2017. What our enforcement program needed in the Trump administration was a head of the office, and I'm glad that the Senate confirmed Susan last year. We still have The head of our emergency response office has not been confirmed yet. I hope the Senate will move forward and confirm Peter Wright. I think it's important to have a head of the office that's responsible for responding to the California fires, the hurricanes, and all the other disasters that EPA is responsible for the response efforts. And we've not had a head of that office now for 2 years.
Well, I think you make that point very well, and let me compliment you on your response to the questions that have been given to you during the course of this hearing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler.
Thank you, Senator Inhofe. Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wheeler, you and I had a chance yesterday to talk about the WRDA bill, a bipartisan bill that passed this committee that provides new tools in dealing with water issues in this country. And we both talked about the fact that you are going to be restrained by funding because some of the issues have not been funded at the level I think this committee would like to see funded. And I agree with you on that, and we're going to work to get you not only the legislative authority but also the resources. In one case, there is funds, and that is the new lead service line replacement grant program. Congress did appropriate $10 million for the program for FY18. Will you commit to standing up the program and providing this committee a status update on how we're dealing with the lead service line replacements?
Absolutely. That is an important part of our lead strategy and our drinking water strategy is to try to make sure that people have safe drinking water and we get the corrosive pipes taken care of and the lead service lines replaced as quickly as possible as well.
I appreciate that, and you'll keep us informed as to how that is so we can...
Yes, Senator. And the legislation you're referring to is the EPA legislation passed as part of WRDA, and that was passed after our appropriations for fiscal year 2019 was passed, the bill that Senator Van Hollen mentioned earlier today, the appropriations bill. So it's my understanding there is no funding in the FY19, except for the $10 million that you just mentioned for that one program. There's no additional funding for the other parts of the legislation that was passed. And I will note that there is a lot of deadlines in the legislation that we're going to try to work on and get
let's hope you have. Let's hope that you have an FY19 budget. So yes, we talked about it at the beginning of this hearing. Just so I think I understand what you're saying in regards to MATS, in regards to the mercury standards. There is a process that's going through in your agency, including comment process. But you are very confident that the current enforcement that's currently being done that is restricted to mercury emissions, that there will be no weakening in regards to the mercury emissions into our environment.
Under our preferred option, which is, when we put out the proposal, we took comments on everything. And you often do that in order to make sure that your proposals are legally sound in case they're challenged later. But under our preferred option, I do not believe there'd be a weakening in the mercury standards at all as far as the equipment that has already been deployed and implemented across the board. I don't think you can, I get accused of rolling back the Clean Power Plan. I don't think you can roll back a regulation that never took effect. And on MATS, I don't think you can roll back a regulation that's been fully implemented. And the MATS requirements for the pollution control equipment has been fully implemented. And I don't believe, I honestly do not believe that that equipment will be turned off or removed under our proposal.
And then let me just respond more to my good friend Senator Inhofe's comments on energy efficiency in our autos with CAFE standards. There's a lot of reasons to be interested in that in regards to energy efficiency issues, particularly in transportation. Part of that is security issues, part of that is economic issues, but under your jurisdictions, the environmental impact. And there is a cost associated with the unnecessary use of fossil fuels as it relates to emissions into our environment. So there is a real reason why we'd like to see more efficiency in the way that we transport. Part of that is the individual vehicle, part of that is transit policies, part of it is a whole way of making people happier, but also more efficient in the use. So I just really want to underscore the point of your very first comments where you were saying progress that you've made in protecting the environment. To me, this is an extremely important, urgent issue, transportation efficiency and protecting our environment. And I hope that as the leader, if you're confirmed, as the administrator of EPA, that you'll be focused on the environment and the impact transportation has on the environment, so that we can use technology that's been developed here in America to help our economy as well as our environment, and also, by the way, the quality of life, if we can get less emissions coming out of our transportation sector. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely. It's not just the energy efficiency or the CO2 from the automobile industry, but we also, as I mentioned in my opening statement, moving forward on removing NOx from the heavy-duty trucks. And that is a program that's not required under statute. It's not required by court order, but we're moving forward with that because it makes sense, because it will protect the health and get more non-attainment areas into attainment around the country.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Carper, you have some unanimous consent requests.
I do, Mr. Chairman. If I could just very briefly follow up on something that Senator Cardin was raising with Mr. Wheeler. I'd ask you to forgive me if I don't feel fully comfortable about the notion that the MATS rule implemented, not rolled back, doesn't somehow lead us in a situation that we have in Delaware with Pennsylvania. For nitrogen oxide, for NOx pollution, in my state, when I was going, I literally could have cut off our economy. All the cars off the road, all the businesses shut down. We'd still be out of compliance for NOx. And the reason why is because of pollution from Pennsylvania, 3 plants, 3 utility plants, coal-fired, and I think 1 in West Virginia. And the cruel irony is each of those plants had installed the technology to stop the pollution and to relieve it to us on the downwind states. They turned it off. They still have it turned off. And when we applied through a Section 126 waiver to try to get the EPA to do something about it, you declined. So forgive me for being just concerned and cautious on this front. I have a couple of unanimous consent requests to put forward, if I may. And I ask unanimous consent to submit, for the record, materials that demonstrate the growing demand for electric and hybrid vehicles and the efforts by the oil industry to lobby in support of this administration's fuel economy rollback.
Without objection.
Thank you. I also ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to submit for the record a comprehensive science report from Syracuse University, Harvard School of Public Health, and other universities that find that the benefits of reducing mercury to our society is around $4 billion per year, not 4 to 6 million, as EPA claims in its
Without
proposal.
objection.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record 2 letters I sent to this administration regarding EPA's proposal to undermine the mercury and air toxics rule. This includes an August 24th, 2018 letter to Mr. Wheeler from Senator Alexander and myself expressing our support to keep the MATS record in place and effective. Second is a December 28th letter to OMB's Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, affectionately known as OIRA, outlining why I have great concerns about the EPA's flawed cost-benefit analysis used in the MATS proposal. And finally, one last one.
Without objection on that.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a variety of materials that include news articles, letters from stakeholders, and other materials relating to Mr. Wheeler's time as EPA acting administrator.
Without objection. And members may submit follow-up questions. For the record, by 5 p.m. is the deadline, Friday, January 18th. Nominees should respond to the questions by 5 p.m. Friday, the 25th of January. And I want to thank the nominee for his time, his testimony today, and that concludes the hearing. The hearing's adjourned.
All right, John.